Lights in the building flickered as Ryan walked down the dark, empty hallway. The walls were a dull bluish-gray color. Ryan had expected the children's-themed pizzeria arcade to be more vibrant and full of life, but the place was dim. Other than crude children's drawings pinned all over, the restaurant felt barren and empty. The few colorful shapes painted on the walls of the arcade were faded. Each footstep Ryan made against the glossy black and white checkered floor echoed loudly. He made his way into an office at the end of the corridor. The office had 2 open doorways on either side, but no doors present. He sat in the office chair and leaned back. There was a desk in front of him with a big analog television serving as a monitor for the CCTV camera system. He pressed one of the keys on a keyboard, and the monitor now showed the cafe and arcade, which were both in the same large room. The camera slowly shifted from side to side every few seconds, and Ryan saw something move behind an arcade machine as soon as the camera showed the left side of the room. A dark silhouette. It retreated to the side as soon as the camera viewed that corner. "What the hell?" Ryan muttered to himself, squinting to focus on the screen. The monitor was dark with a heavy blue tint that made things difficult to see. As he backed away from the screen, a sudden sound became apparent. Cheerful circus music. Ryan got up and walked out the left doorway and down a long hall into a much larger room. The upper half of the walls were painted dark blue with fun shapes and colors just like the arcade. However, they too were faded. At the end was a huge show stage blocked by thick red curtains. Long rows of tables were aligned in front of it, each having confetti-patterned tablecloth and birthday hats lined down the middle. There was a lit-up spinning carousel in the corner of the room near the stage that was powered on. Ryan instantly realized this is where the music was coming from. He carefully tiptoed over to it and looked for a button to shut it off. The music was now so loud that it was hurting his ears. After examining the huge machine, he noticed its base was plugged into the wall. He leaned down and grabbed the cord. He pulled it out and the music stopped. The carousel shut down instantly. Ryan leaned on the wall, enjoying the silence and peace until a laugh came from the stage. The low chuckle startled him. He jerked his head upward immediately to face where the sound came from. He grabbed the crimson velvet fabric curtain and pulled it open just a crack. It was too dark to see the robotic mascots inside until 2 tiny beams of light activated. Ryan stared at the 2 lights as they moved closer, with heavy footsteps against the stage floor accompanying. It took him a moment to realize that one of the robots was walking toward him. The 2 beams of light were coming from its eyes. Not wanting to interact with it, Ryan closed the curtain and started speed-walking back to his office. On his way, he heard something clanking behind the purple curtains of a separate, smaller stage in the corner of the room. He cracked this curtain open too, but only for a few seconds. As he peered into the abyss, the metallic sound stopped. And suddenly the animatronic character got up and darted at him. Ryan quickly turned around and rushed down the hall screaming. As he turned into his office, he saw the character still behind him. The mascot was moving so fast that it looked like a red blur, growing larger as it came closer. There were 2 big square buttons just next to the open doorway. In the heat of the moment, Ryan pressed one of them and a large metal door slowly slid down into place, blocking the red animatronic from getting in. Ryan breathed a sigh of relief, not knowing what stood in the open doorway behind him. He turned around. The violet anthropomorphic rabbit towered over him. Its ears were long and almost touched the ceiling. Its dark metallic eyelids were narrow. Its jaw was a brighter color than the rest of its body. Ryan had little time to analyze it any further because in only a single second, it opened its mouth and lunged at him. "Bye, Dad," Mia yelled, taking off across the grass field to her mother's house. Mike waved goodbye to his daughter, but noticed his ex-wife's husband was walking out of the house and toward his car. Not wanting anything to do with him, Mike rolled up his window and shifted his car into drive. He floored it down the road and out of the wealthy neighborhood. Once he was far away from the house, he slowed down and began driving more carefully. He stopped at a stop sign and turned on the radio. The music was fuzzy, but he immediately knew the song playing. Everyday Struggle by Notorious B.I.G., a popular song at the time, Mike felt the lyrics as he listened. Dropping off his daughter at his ex-wife's house put him in a sour mood. It resulted in resounding emptiness and loneliness. Despite the lyrics being dark, the tune was high-pitched and not very depressing. It sounded light and almost a bit happy. When Mike got home, he stopped his car at the curb, not wanting to park in the driveway. As he took the key out of the ignition, the engine turned off and the car's ambience ceased. All he could hear now was the tapping of raindrops against his windshield. The blue-hour rain seemed to perfectly match his mood. Rather than coming home to a loving wife and daughter, he would now come home to empty furniture topped off with junk food wrappers and beer cans. He stepped out onto the street, looking both ways. He noticed a car slowly driving through the neighborhood in his direction. He pinned himself against his car to let the person drive by. And as soon as it passed, he turned around and walked over to the sidewalk. He noticed the accumulation of rainwater passing down the gutters swiftly, rolling into a drain at the end of the street. Mike stretched out before trudging into his house. A slip of paper was taped to his front door. He took it off and held it closer to his eyes to read it carefully. Eviction notice was printed at the top in bold letters. The note stated that Mike had to be out of the house by October 27th. He rolled his eyes, not caring enough to read the rest. Mike tore the note in half. He then tore the two halves into 4 total pieces and kept nonchalantly ripping it up until it was nothing more than confetti he proceeded to sprinkle onto the porch below. Bullshit, he grumbled. He put the key in the keyhole of his door and turned it. For some reason, he couldn't turn it fully. It got jammed halfway through and he had to pull back and forth, fidgeting with it. Anger quickly built up until he finally managed to unlock it. He opened the door and stepped inside. Sure enough, his house was exactly as messy as he left it. Not that he expected anything different. Mike threw off his coveralls and laid on the couch. He sighed. He wanted to fall asleep forever. Never again would he think about anything of the past few years. He looked at a family photo on the wall. It had been taken just 5 years prior. His ex-wife looked beautiful. Then he looked at himself in the photo, a happy man in shape who was ready for the world. Finally, he looked at his daughter, who was only a newborn in the photo. He missed her dearly, a lot more than his wife. She was his pride and joy. He spent his days wishing his time with her wasn't relegated to simply Wednesdays and every other weekend. Mike turned to look at the time. It was 8:47 p.m. He contemplated whether or not he should drink. It had been almost 3 days since he last did. Because he would have the next day off, the ramifications like having a hangover didn't matter. He decided to just go for it. He lazily strolled to the cupboard. There was a large bottle of vodka, still half full. He pulled it out and poured only a cup of it into a nearby glass. The TV was on in the background, playing the most recent episode of Friends. As the alcohol coursed through Mike's system, he began relaxing. The jokes in the show slowly became more humorous. Even jokes that were unfunny became funny to Mike. He tried to set his bottle of vodka and glass on the table ahead of him, but couldn't because it was cluttered with garbage. "Damn it," he said. While watching the show, Mike stood up and grabbed the trash can from the kitchen. He set it next to the table and swept all of the garbage into it. The plastic cups and paper plates all fell into it to reveal Mia's Game Boy was buried underneath. He remembered when she told him she had lost it. Mike felt guilty upon finding out it had been under his carelessly piled trash the whole time. He picked it up and turned it on. Somehow it still had sufficient battery life. Mike had no idea how to operate it, but managed to figure out by clicking buttons to see what happened. The screen was extremely dim. He had to turn on the light just to see what was on it, and as soon as he finally did see, the light glared off of it annoyingly. He sat back down on the couch and tilted it at an awkward angle that finally allowed him to discern what was happening. A familiar title popped up, Super Mario Land. Mike was familiar with the Super Mario games and figured this one would be exactly like the rest of them. He created a new save file for himself and started with the first level. Sure enough, it felt like the same 2D side-scroller he was used to from Super Mario on the arcade machines and friends' houses. He found pleasure in playing the video game while having a show on in the background, and being tipsy as well. All of the stimulation temporarily entertained him. Reveling in these distractions took his mind off of the pain. When commercials came on, Mike would simply divert his attention to the game more than the shows. Mike didn't even notice other sitcoms airing in the background after the episodes of Friends. Hours passed before, out of nowhere, Mike's telephone rang. He stood up, extremely dizzy. Mike looked at the small screen and recognized the phone number. It was his ex-wife's new husband. After it rang, the voicemail tone went off. Mike rolled his eyes and listened. Hey, Mike, this is Daniel. I'm calling for a custody negotiation. Mike instantly felt bitter upon hearing the man's voice. See, when she's at your house, she doesn't get her homework done, and it's just not convenient. We're thinking maybe you could have her for 1 month in the summer, so, Mike decided to pick up the phone and answer. Hey, Daniel, he said with wicked joy. I just wanted to say, fuck you. He spoke with a sarcastically happy tone. It felt euphoric to let Daniel have a piece of his mind rather than filtering his thoughts. See, here's what I think. I think you can go eat shit. Mike wanted to go on and let his rage be known. He wanted to comment on how little custody he already had, and any less time than that would be patently absurd. He hung up the phone, not letting Daniel get another word in. It felt way too good. The consequences were far from his mind, so he went back to distracting himself. Eventually, he got too tired to continue both playing the game and watching TV, so he saved his progress, turned off the Game Boy, and put it back on the desk, now in a spot where he could clearly see it. He stretched out on the couch and laid down, exhausted. His focus on the TV slowly diminished as everything faded to black.
Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria.
Mike heard an excited male voice yell loudly. The TV was still playing in the background. He opened his eyes. It was now morning. Light seeped in through the cracks in the drapes over his windows. When his eyes finally got used to the brightness of the room, he glanced up at the TV. There was a commercial playing of a local pizzeria.
Enjoy games, pizza, family fun, and more!
The voice continued. The videos in the background were of kids playing arcade games, eating pizza, and having fun. Mike's head was in excruciating pain, and the bright colors and loud cheering of kids from the commercial contributed to his migraine. He reached out to the coffee table for the remote and turned the TV off. Mike's throat was sore and his stomach felt as though it was dropping rapidly, like a rock thrown into the sea. Coming into consciousness, he started to realize the pain was not just physical but mental. He recognized the feeling of anxiety, but in his tired state he struggled to remember what he was actually anxious about. It took him a little while of recounting the events of the previous night before the memories hit him like a bullet. He remembered everything he said to Daniel. Shit, he thought. He rushed over to the telephone in the kitchen. There were no new messages nor missed calls. He thought about how foolish it was to insult Daniel when custody of his daughter was on the line. Mike's sudden clarity continued as he looked around at the piles of filth. He had let his house go to complete trash to the point where every time Mia came over, he was too embarrassed to have her there for long periods of time. He would always bring her to other places like the park or the library. During the summer, he often took her to amusement parks or pools in the area. Mike realized only then that going out and doing these things disrupted her getting her homework done, as Daniel correctly pointed out in his voicemail. Mike walked to the fridge and bent down. A box of trash bags sat beside the garbage can. He grabbed a big garbage bag and brought it to the living room, where he quickly tossed all the paper plates, plastic cups, and beer cans. The table was already clear, but the corners of the room were still messy. He picked up a can and examined it for a moment. The alcohol content was nearly 10%. He grabbed his bottle of vodka and contemplated throwing it away, but decided not to. He instead set it back down at the end of the now empty coffee table. Mike passed the sink and glanced at it. A pile of dishes had been there for months. It was so bad that he had resorted to using paper and plastic. It reminded him of his college days, back when he lived like a pig and couldn't care less. He made a mental note to wash the dishes in a moment. He heaved the hefty bag of garbage over his shoulder like it was Santa's sack and walked out the door. Upon stepping outside, he spotted the ripped up pieces of the eviction notice. They had become soaked from the rainwater. Mike's stomach ached even more when he saw them, suddenly reminded that he only had days to move out. The custody battle for Mia was going to be all the more difficult, having to move out of his house and possibly into an apartment. With only $1,000 left to his name in his retirement fund, he couldn't just put down on a new house. Mike opened the large green trash bin at the end of his yard and plopped the bag inside. What the hell am I going to do? He asked himself. He went back inside and washed the dishes. As time dragged on, more anxiety built up. He had procrastinated for so long, but only now did that all impact him. This particular moment was filled with sudden clarity. He had many clarity-filled mornings in the past, but after the eviction notice and the voicemail, this one was stronger than the rest. If he didn't get his act together now, he may never see Mia again. While scrubbing months-old food off of one of the plates, Mike dialed his boss's phone number and put the telephone on speaker. After a few rings, his boss picked up.
"Mike, this better be important. I'm with my family right now. What do you want?"
His boss asked. "Yeah, hey, I was just wondering if I could, work more hours this week," Mike politely requested.
"Michael, you're already working full-time, 9 to 5 every weekday. I can't give you any more hours than that unless you want to take back Wednesdays."
"I can't do that." Mike was unwilling to give up Wednesdays, which he would spend with Mia. "Well, then, what about a raise?" His boss laughed.
"What, do you think I'm made of money?"
"No, I've just been a valuable member of this company for so long. I'm getting evicted, I gotta pay child support and alimony, and on top of that," his boss cut him off.
"Look, unless you're having a baby, I don't care to hear your sob story. But if you're really itching for more work, you could always get a second job. Oh, I gotta go."
His boss then hung up abruptly, without even saying goodbye. Mike was frustrated. He hated it when people ended calls seemingly from out of nowhere, but Mike was only left with one option: get another job, a part-time one on the side. He wandered into the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror. His facial hair was overgrown. He grabbed shaving cream at the corner of the sink and smeared it all over the lower half of his face. Long strands of brown hair fell as Mike grazed the razor along his skin. He would take long, firm strokes with it, and then run it under hot water to wash off the shaving cream that got caught. There was still a fair amount of hair left, just no excess. A wizardly beard is something Mike didn't feel he needed or wanted. When he was done, he went outside, locking the door behind him. He got in his car and noticed he was almost empty on gas. He drove for only a few blocks just until he reached the local library. Mike recognized how lazy it was to drive to the library when it was only down the road, but that didn't stop him from proceeding. He parked just outside the library and went in. The atmosphere inside was quiet and peaceful. The old librarian instantly recognized him. "Michael, it's so good to see you," she greeted. "Yeah, you too," he replied awkwardly. "Where's Mia? Is she here today, or is it just you?" "It's just me," Mike chuckled. "You guys have the newspaper, right?" "Yup, just outside the building in the small blue booth." Mike looked back at the 2-foot-tall plastic booth just outside the glass door and felt stupid for missing it. He laughed. "Oh, my bad, I can't believe I missed that." "Oh dear, everyone does. I have a copy right here, actually." The librarian reached into a drawer and pulled out the newspaper. She clearly struggled with arthritis, and it took way longer than it should have. She eventually just dropped the paper onto the counter between her and Mike. "You looking to get the latest scoop?" "No, I'm looking for listings for houses and jobs. Being a single parent ain't easy. I could totally use some extra cash right now." "Oh yes, I understand," the librarian told him. "I too was a single parent at one point. Husband passed away long ago, but my boy is grown up now and doesn't need his mother." Oh, Mike stuttered, not knowing what else to say. He wasn't in the mood to hear this old woman ramble about her life story. "So if you don't have any luck finding anything here, remember, we have a newspaper archive below. It's in the lower level on the computer. We even have issues dating back to the late 1800s, all the way up to last week. So if you don't find anything, you can look in last week's paper and print it out. It'll only cost you a few cents. And of course, I could always get you a subscription to the paper if you want. Just let me know if you're interested, and I can help you with the details." "Alright, thank you. Of course. If there's anything else you need, let me know. I'll be here." Mike nodded and grabbed the red marking pen. "Can I borrow this?" The librarian nodded. Mike looked down at the paper. Before he could even turn the page, the librarian stuck her finger out to point at a certain job listing. "Oh, what about this job right here?" The picture showed a large bear mascot with the words "Help Wanted" in a huge font. Mike skimmed it briefly without giving it any consideration. The listing looked to be for a children's arcade. Mike imagined himself cleaning up vomit and dancing around in a mascot suit. He cringed at the very idea and turned the page. "Nah, this looks like a kid's place. Not really my thing." "Well, beggars can't be choosers, you know. But good luck, Michael." Mike nodded and walked out the door. He brought the newspaper over to a nearby picnic table. He skimmed through pages he didn't care to read. There were funny stories, national news, results of local sports games, and crossword puzzles, until he reached the job listings. The first one in the top corner of the page read Circle K cashier needed. He circled it. The ad next to it was for a paralegal. Mike didn't meet the qualifications for a job like that, so he skipped it. He circled every easy-seeming minimum wage job he could find. Throughout the week, he applied to work at many businesses all across the town and found no luck in getting a job. He didn't have many advantages, from his legal history of making trouble as a teen to his lack of experience in most fields. Nobody seemed to want to hire Mike. Outside of being a forklift operator at the warehouse he worked in, he hadn't worked any real jobs, only odd jobs and under-the-table gigs, none of which ever lasted long. He didn't have any notable skills like playing instruments or speaking different languages, so after a week of countless interviews with no success, he came back to the library. "Hey, can I get this week's paper really quick? I just want to keep searching," he asked the librarian, throwing out a fake chuckle to mask his frustration. "Yes, of course." The librarian struggled to reach into the drawer and grab it with her arthritis. Mike was about to ask if she needed help, but before he could encourage himself to do so, she already had the newspaper lying on the counter. "No luck?" she asked. "Nope, no luck. It's so stupid. It's like these places just say that they want people, and..." Mike stopped himself and stifled the large tangent that was to come before it would get loud and annoying. As soon as the newspaper fell out of the librarian's frail hands and onto the countertop, Mike instantly spotted the same advertisement as the week before in the center of the page. It stuck out like a sore thumb. "Help Wanted" was written in big capital letters this time. Beneath was the same image of the same mascot bear as before. Desperate, Mike decided to actually read the listing and inquired about it. Upon examining the listing, he could tell that the anthropomorphic bear in the colorless photo was an animatronic. He had been to several cafes in his life with animatronic animals, and was glad to think he may not have to embarrassingly wear a mascot costume after all, if he could get this job. The robotic bear held a microphone in his left hand and donned a black top hat. His right hand was in the air, waving to an audience. His eyes were very wide in the picture and his mouth was hung open, yet his expression still felt blank somehow. Despite being a black and white photo, the felt on the robot was very detailed. His jaw had 3 dots on both sides, like whisker bumps. Only the bottom jaw had teeth, little white squares protruding out. The animatronic's top jaw was a lighter color than the rest of its body. His plastic eyebrows were big and dark. You know, I think that Freddy Fazbear's pizza place is hiring people," the librarian remarked. "Yeah, you think so?" Mike asked sarcastically. He read the description in his head. "Family pizzeria looking for a security guard to work the night shift, 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. Monitor cameras, ensure safety of the equipment and animatronic characters. Not responsible for injury or dismemberment." Mike raised his eyebrows. He wondered why they needed to include that, but gave little attention to it. He was more focused on the pay, which was listed as $120 per week. It was also a security job, which meant he wouldn't have to do many of the unsavory tasks he had imagined being assigned at a children's restaurant. The company's phone number was at the bottom. Mike took the pen and circled this. It sounded easy enough. Find a way to pass the time while looking around every now and then until 6 in the morning. He glanced at his watch and realized it was 8:43. He only had 17 minutes to drive to his job across town. "I gotta go," he said. "Can I just keep this?" "Of course," the librarian said, smiling. "You need it more than I do, but I think you should really get a subscription to..." "Thanks," Mike concluded abruptly, racing out the door. Ted peered out the window as the car came to a stop. The building they parked in front of was big and dynamic. It was the size of a supermarket. The family could hear music blasting from within the establishment. Being at a distance, the music was faint. There was a huge glowing sign on the face of the building. Ted stared at it. The sign showed cartoon versions of the animatronic mascots from the waist up. There was a brown bear, a purple bunny, a yellow bird, and a red fox. The bird was holding a pink cupcake with eyes that appeared to be a character of its own. The fox was wearing an eye patch and had a metal hook for a hand, implying that he was some sort of pirate. They all had bright eyes and looked happy. Large orange glowing letters spelled out Freddy Fazbear's and then pizza in cursive, with 3 yellow lights on both sides of the last word. Each of the lights would shine one at a time in a row, as though light was moving from one side to the other. The entire logo was bordered in a bright orange strip that took on the same color as the font. Above the whole sign were small colorful stars aligned around in the shape of a rainbow. There was another identical sign on a post at the edge of the parking lot, but the stars were not there, and "Where fantasy and fun come to life" was at the bottom of the logo. There were pillars holding up the front of the building, and the windows had small triangular blue rooftops of their own, with red strips at the bottom. The whole structure took on a light beige color. "Oh man," Howard said, looking at Linda, "it's like we're kids again." "Wait, this place was here when you guys were kids? I thought it just opened," Tony asked. "Well, we were probably just at the end of high school," Linda answered, "but we went on a few dates here back in the day. Your father and I actually met down the road there at Richland High." She pointed down the long street that went uphill past Freddy's. "And we'd come down here every Friday." "Why would anyone take their girlfriend here for a date? This place is for kids." "Well, they had arcade machines," Howard answered. "That was the biggest thing back in the day." The family stepped out of their car and sauntered toward Freddy's. But it wasn't exactly as Linda and Howard had remembered it. Howard's face fell as he approached the restaurant. A thin black and white checkered banner still ran along the outer walls, aligned with red. But it was out of shape, torn and tattered, the colors faded. Parts of the building were visibly decaying. The sign was rusted and the colors were not as saturated. They were still bright, but slightly faded. "When was it open?" Tony asked. "It opened in the early 80s, I think, so I was 16, maybe 17 or 18, Howard answered. Something about the place felt off. While Ted was ecstatic to be there, his father got a strange feeling. Howard leaned in and whispered to Linda, "Is it just me, or does this place not really look the same as like when we were kids?" She shrugged, taking Ted's hand. Howard couldn't tell if Freddy's had always been like this, or if the reopening was simply in worse condition. He wondered if being an adult made the colors less vibrant and the joyous place far less whimsical than it actually was. As evidence to this, his younger son was thrilled to be there. The family went through the vestibule and into the lobby. Howard, remembering the layout of the building, tried to proceed forward, but was stopped by someone at a desk. "Hey," the woman stuck her hand out, stopping him from going any further. "You need to register here." Howard turned and rolled his eyes. "You can't just walk in and sit down anymore?" he asked, annoyed. "No, there's a whole process. I'm going to need you to sign some papers. It'll only take a second." Howard sighed. "Alright, give me the stuff." The middle-aged woman handed him a contract and he started reading it. Ted was very eager to play arcade games and tried to subtly walk away from his family. "Wait here," his father called out to him. Howard made sure to read both pages of the contract very carefully. That's when he noticed something odd. Why does it say Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for missing persons or the death of any individual?" he asked. "I don't know," the employee responded. "It's probably for company assurance, that's all." "Well, if you gotta have something like this in your contract, that means it's happened before." "Howard!" Linda nudged him, and nodded her head in the direction of Ted, who was noticeably anxious to play. She didn't care about all the waivers and contracts and had no interest in reading them. Howard reluctantly decided to sign them without reading the last few paragraphs. "Excellent, so the hall straight ahead is to the playroom with plastic tubes and slides. The hall to the right is for the cafe and arcade, and the hall to your left is for the show stage room with Freddy and the gang." Howard looked at Ted. "Alright, bud, what do you want to do first?" Ted pointed straight for the arcade. "Looks like he wants to play games first," Howard chuckled. Ted raced forward as his family followed behind. They all slowly made their way into the arcade. The hall to it was very dark and narrow, but the room at the end was large. It seemed to be divided in half by a pony wall in the middle. The closer half was the cafe, while the further half was the arcade. Several red and blue booths were aligned along the main wall and pony wall. Small tables were scattered in between. On the other side of the pony wall was the arcade. The entire arcade had its own black carpet with colorful dots and ribbon-like shapes. The walls took on a turquoise color, and the top half was dark blue with shapes and colors painted all over. There was music in the background, but it was mostly drowned out by the hordes of kids running around squealing. On the cafe side of the room, there were two gargantuan rectangular holes in the wall with big metal countertops like windows into the kitchen. A line of people stood in front of one of them, placing their orders. Another line stood by the other one, picking up their food. "Time really did a number on this place," Linda whispered to Howard. The paint was all faded. Large lights hung down from rows of industrial ceiling bars, but they were somewhat dim. Howard found a small crowd of bugs on the plastic surface of one of the bulbs. The light emanating was a dark orange color, not even bright enough to strain his eyes when he stared. Luckily, the windows on the arcade side of the room let in enough daylight to fully brighten the space. The shapes in the arcade's carpet were no longer glowing. The carpet was clearly musty and stained to the point where most of the larger shapes looked divided and unrecognizable. Howard took his wallet out of his pocket and walked up to a nearby money exchange machine. He inserted $10, and after a few seconds, quarters began to pour into a metal tray at the bottom. Howard tried to count them as they flooded out, but there were so many that he ended up just handing uneven piles to his two boys. He took a small portion of the quarters for himself. As soon as Ted and Tony got enough, they bolted to the arcade. Linda watched them carefully. "Should we get pizza?" she asked. "Nah," Howard responded, counting the rest of the quarters. "We just ate. We'll have it another time. Now, where's Pac-Man?" Tony looked around and found himself at the Spider-Man arcade game. Ted was waiting to play Donkey Kong. However, a small group of stubborn kids hogged the machine. Ted would have put up a fuss about it, but the two much older kids looked rough around the edges, so instead he found a different game, Street Fighter. He put in a quarter and digitally beat up bad guys for several minutes. Meanwhile, Howard searched for his favorite arcade games. "I found Pac-Man!" Linda pointed at the corner of the arcade. Howard practically jogged to it. Linda followed. Upon getting closer, he frowned. "No, this is Miss Pac-Man, not Pac-Man. Miss Pac-Man is different." "Oh, whatever." Howard put in a quarter but enjoyed himself nonetheless. The kids all around the arcade were having a blast. Even though the building itself had clearly aged with time, the atmosphere with the children was still just as energetic. As soon as Ted lost on Street Fighter, he noticed some kids running into the next room over. He followed them. The next room was huge. There were several sizable, colorful plastic tunnels intertwining. There were different layers of them that went up to the ceiling. Several slides ran down from the large play structure and into a ball pit that took up a significant chunk of the floor. The windows in the back of the room were mostly covered by the tubular tunnels. There was a big red shoe cubby near the large cased opening into the room. A paper with the rules was taped to the wall just beside it. Ted read the rules. 1. Don't run. 2. Don't yell. 3. Don't scream. 4. Don't poop on the floor. With his age and maturity level, Ted couldn't help but giggle at the 4th rule. However, the rest of the rules were odd. 5. Stay close to Mom. 6. Don't touch Freddy. 7. Don't hit. 8. Leave before dark. Ted realized he had already broken the 5th rule, but didn't care. He looked back at the play structure, which was surrounded by benches where parents sat and chatted. Ted glanced around and saw multiple entrances into it. He decided to climb a ladder up into a big pink tunnel. Inside, he noticed black and brown stains all over, as if these tunnels only got cleaned once or twice a year. They smelled foul, though this didn't bother him. He happened to be right next to a large green tube slide, so he dove in head first. After a few seconds of rapidly swirling down, he landed in the ball pit. The colorful plastic balls cushioned his head from what would have been a painful landing if he hit the bottom. There was a large black net that acted as a wall between the ball pit and the surface. The pit was deeper than Ted expected, and it took effort to walk out of it. Wanting to see what else the pizzeria had to offer, he ran down a dark hallway in the middle of the room, passing by the bathrooms. Excited, he sprinted as fast as he could until he accidentally bumped into Mike, who was just entering. Hey, watch where you're going, bud," Mike said, stepping back. Ted jumped back onto his feet. "Sorry," he whimpered nervously. He rushed back to the arcade. Mike glanced around. The walls were a dull shade of blue, and the floor was made up of black and white checkered tiles. There were 3 dark hallways, one to the left, one to the right, which clearly led to the arcade, and one in the middle, where Ted had just sprinted from. Mike meandered up to the employee at the counter, but before he could even speak, she waved her hand out. "You're not allowed in unless you have a child. Sorry," she warned unenthusiastically. Mike studied her for a moment, a middle-aged woman with dark hair and rings around her eyes. The bottom half of her hair was dyed blue. Her name tag read May. "Actually, I'm here for an interview," Mike explained. "I called in earlier and..." "Yeah, okay, so you're gonna go down here," May interrupted, pointing down the hallway in the middle of the room. "And to the left. Just sit at one of the tables and I'll let them know you're here." Mike nodded, slightly ticked off by the sudden interruption. He ambled down the dark hallway. In the middle of it, the lights above flickered. Mike glared up at the lights and then back down. "Poor wiring," he muttered. "Playroom" was spelled out in cursive neon letters on a sign. He peered at the tall structure of different colored plastic tunnels and slides. A few tiny plastic balls had rolled out of the pit and were scattered on the floor. Mike tried his best to not step on any of them and took a left turn. There was a big open doorway into the next room, and this room was the loudest. There was a large show stage at the end of it, with the animatronic mascots. Shiny red curtains were pulled to the side of the performance. Colored lights at the top of the stage were moving around. The main animatronic, Freddy Fazbear himself, stood in the middle of the stage. He creaked around, his mouth moving up and down to the tune of a rock song. Mike remembered seeing him in the newspaper listing, but he didn't expect the robot to look as dull and lifeless as it did in real life. Freddy's dark eyelids were halfway glazed over his blue eyes. His movements were only slightly more fluid than Mike expected. Freddy's arms were shaped like small, long barrels connecting to one another. He held the microphone up to his mouth. The song playing had been dubbed over by a designated voice actor for Freddy. His voice was deep. Next to him was a rabbit animatronic. Freddy and this rabbit had the exact same shape, as if they were built almost the same way. However, the rabbit wore a red bow tie and didn't have a top hat. He didn't have whisker dots on the top part of his jaw. He had no eyebrows and his irises were pink. Rather than bear ears protruding from the top corners of his head, this robot had rabbit ears. The top parts of his ears were bending down slightly. Mike debated whether this animatronic was blue or purple, but the colorful flashing lights made it difficult to decipher. He held a red bass guitar, and his fingers strummed the strings to the tune of the music. Though Mike knew the robotic mascot was not actually playing the guitar, the sounds were coming from the speakers. It was all for show. On the other side of Freddy was a yellow bird animatronic. Her head was round, her eyebrows were even larger than Freddy's. She had an orange pelican-like beak. Only the bottom of her beak had teeth. There was a large cartoonish tuft of hair on the top of her head, made up of 3 big pieces of felt-covered plastic that stuck out. She wore a bib over her chest with the words "Let's Eat" printed in big yellow bubbly letters outlined in magenta. The words were followed by 3 exclamation marks. Her irises were the same color as Bonnie's, the same shade of pink. She held a plate with an animatronic cupcake. The cupcake's base was brown and the frosting was pink. There were 2 buck teeth coming down from the frosting as though this was the cupcake's face. It had big brown eyes. All of the animatronics had their pelvises as a separate piece from their legs and torsos. Their eyes were slightly too small for the eye holes cut into the mascot heads. Therefore, it looked like dark rings bordered their eyes. Their hands all had 4 fingers. Behind them was a tan-colored brick wall with a checkered banner that ran along the entire building. There were strings dangling from the ceiling with plastic outlines of stars on the ends. Paper plates stapled together and taped to the wall made up clouds. There were 2 large stereos on the sides of the stage, blasting music. Vertically in front of the stage sat lengthy rows of tables full of children and families. Most of them were drawing pictures or eating food. Mike took a seat at the nearest table to the doorway, trying to ignore the music. Minutes passed before Freddy's song eventually came to an end.
Wow, all that singing and dancing really works up an appetite,
the bird animatronic said, her mouth moving to the words. She had a deep feminine voice, like that of a mother who was speaking to her toddler.
Well, I did most of the work,
the rabbit responded. He sounded like a cool male teenager.
Well, anyway, the show will be back in 5 minutes, he announced.
Their black eyelids rolled over as the curtains swept downward, covering the stage. The room was still far from quiet. The families were all loud as ever, but most of the children started to roam into other rooms, needing to constantly be stimulated. Just then, Mike noticed a thin, darker-skinned man in a suit with oval-shaped glasses walk over to his table. He sat down across from Mike and stuck out his hand. "Hi, I'm Robert. You must be Mike," he welcomed. Yeah, that's me," Mike replied awkwardly, shaking his hand. "Have you heard of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza before, or any Fazbear Entertainment-run restaurant?" "Nope," Mike answered honestly. "I just saw your ad in the paper." "Okay," Robert nodded. "So, when can you start?" Mike was caught off guard by this question. Don't you want to ask me some stuff first?" Robert glanced around the room and back at Mike, now speaking more quietly. "Look, Mike, I do, but we just had our..." Robert stopped himself and decided to summarize what he was about to say. "We're desperate for new hires. You look big and strong like a security guard, so you're in. When can you start?" "As soon as possible," Mike said, his tone half excited. Robert stood up. "Alright, come on, I'll show you your office." The 2 men tread down a large dark hallway with no windows and extremely dim lights. "So you'll be here from midnight to 6 a.m. Pictures crudely drawn in crayon were littered all over the walls. They were clearly made by very young children. The 2 men passed a cracked open door to the janitorial closet, which Robert grabbed and shut. At the end was the office. There was a window and an open doorway in. Robert stood at the open doorway and Mike waited by the window. Mike was unable to see much of the office. All he could observe was that it had hardwood floors rather than tiles, and it was very small. "So, this is Peter," Robert introduced. There was a tall man with a large dark brown beard sitting in the chair. His hair was messy and he looked homeless. He seemed to be between old and middle-aged. He wore a black nondescript baseball cap and a black jacket. "Who's he?" Mike asked. Peter looked up at Mike and Robert. He nodded his head in Mike's direction in an attempt to subtly greet him. The man was clearly off in his own world. "He's the day shift guard. He might keep you informed, leave notes, or ask questions, but anyway, this'll be your office during the night. I think one of our last night shift guys left voice messages on the phone. I don't really know how it works. I think they play out every night for new hires or something. I haven't really listened to them because the guy's a huge talker, but he's been with us for a while, so I'm sure it's all fine." Robert started walking down the hall they came from. Mike followed. Robert turned to the right and then to the right again down more hallways that led to the other side of the office. On that side there was another window into it, and another open doorway. He then turned left and led Mike back to the lobby. "Remember, your shift starts at midnight. Here's the key." Robert took a key out of his shirt pocket and tossed it to Mike. Mike was barely able to catch it. "Oh, and we like to conserve power a lot here, so don't be using too much of it at night." "Thanks," Mike concluded, dropping the key into his pocket. Robert nodded and went to the bathroom. Mike left through the vestibule. As he walked into the parking lot, he felt relieved. The job seemed simple enough, and he got it with such ease. He didn't have to fill out a bunch of annoying paperwork. All he did was walk in and walk out. The entire interview took all of 5 minutes, if even that. He jumped into his car and drove home. As he expected, his best friend Corey was parked by the curb in a U-Haul truck. Mike pulled into his driveway and Corey stepped out. "I thought you said you were going to be here earlier," he said. "Sorry, I had a quick interview," Mike replied. "Well, you ready to move?" Mike's muscles were sore from work, but he was already well past the eviction date, and with the help of Corey, everything was transferred into a storage unit in only a matter of hours. Mike awoke to electronic beeping. He opened his eyes and looked at the digital alarm clock. The time was 11:30. He slapped it softly, hitting the button to turn it off. He got up and stretched out. With only 4 hours of sleep, Mike had 30 minutes to make it to Freddy's from Corey's apartment. He turned on the lights and immediately shut his eyes. The sudden light hit like a flashbang grenade. He opened his suitcase and laid it out. He moved the folded clothes around until he found a light blue dress shirt that looked appropriate for his first day on the job. He took a moment to decide whether or not a dark blue tie would complement it. He ultimately decided against wearing it and put it back in the suitcase. He tiredly hobbled out into the living room where Corey was still watching TV. "Morning," he said sarcastically. Mike ignored him and went to the bathroom to see if he looked presentable enough. He turned on the faucet and cupped his hand to catch some water, which he then splashed into his hair. He adjusted his hair with his hands to be less messy. He then brushed his teeth, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door. Mike sat in his car and drove to Freddy's. The roads were all quiet and empty. He had the radio on at a low volume and could hear an old song softly playing. The sign at Freddy's was still lit up. The rows of small yellow lights were still glowing one after the other. Mike remembered what Robert said about trying to conserve their usage of electricity. "Yeah, right," Mike grumbled. He walked up to the building, fishing the key out of his pocket. He inserted it into the keyhole and turned it all the way to the right. As soon as it clicked, he pushed the door open. The next door was already unlocked, so Mike proceeded through. The lobby was lit up only from the moonlight outside, but the 3 hallways were pitch black. Mike went through the left one. 2 halls seemed to intersect here, the one from the lobby and the sub-hallway coming from the one leading to the room with the animatronics. The right side entrance to his office was between both. Mike sat down in the office chair, finding it comfortable. His eyes were now adjusted to the darkness, and he could see a small computer mouse in front of him. He wiggled it, and a big analog monitor turned on. The screen's glow lit up the room. The desk before him was long and had 2 drawers on one side. The monitor displayed live video feed from a camera aimed at the arcade. Its quality was grainy. The screen took on a blue tint that nearly drowned out every other color. A big keyboard sat in front of the monitor. There was a sticky note on the top left corner of it. Mike grabbed it and tried reading the poor handwriting from presumably Peter, the day shift guard. It was a list of different keyboard commands. F1, cafe. F2, arcade. F3, playroom, and so on. Mike clicked the F1 key on the keyboard and the monitor showed the cafe. The setup seemed simple enough to understand. On the middle of the desk was a large black industrial fan that made a faint electric buzzing sound. On top of the big monitor sat a small pink cupcake with large eyes, just like the one the bird animatronic held, but much smaller. A stereo covered in dust and cobwebs was just below the desk. A big poster was hung up on the wall, a picture of the animatronics with the word "Celebrate" at the top in a retro font. There was a dim orange light on the ceiling that Mike didn't even know about until he looked up. It wasn't even bright enough to gain his attention upon entering. On top of some unorganized documents scattered on the desk, there was a swirling pink striped soda cup Peter had likely left behind. More crude children's drawings were pinned to the wall just above the desk. Mike stood up and peeked out the side of the room. There were 2 open doorways to his office on opposite sides, the left and the right, and next to each of these doorways were windows into the halls. There were also panels beside them, each having 2 shiny square buttons. The top buttons were red and the bottom ones were white. The red ones were labeled door underneath and the white ones were labeled light. Mike was confused about how it all worked, but didn't care. He had no interest in learning how to actually do his job, only receiving the paycheck. All of a sudden, a phone rang loudly. Mike perked up and searched for where the phone was. It rang 2 more times before it abruptly ended with a clicking sound, as if it had been answered.
Hello? Hello?
Said the man on the phone with a sheepish tone.
I wanted to record a message for you to help you get settled in on your first night.
Oh, great, Mike thought. And these are the phone recordings Robert was talking about. The man's recording continued.
I actually worked in that office before you. I'm finishing up my last week now, as a matter of fact, so I know it can be a bit overwhelming, but I'm here to tell you there's nothing to worry about. You'll do fine. So let's just focus on getting you through your first week, okay? Let's see.
He paused for a moment to gather his thoughts.
First, there's an introductory greeting from the company that I'm supposed to read. It's kind of a legal thing, you know. Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a magical place for kids and grown-ups alike, where fantasy and fun come to life.
The man on the phone sounded monotone, very clearly reading these words off of a paper with no emotion.
Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for damage to property or person. Upon discovering that damage or death has occurred, a missing person report will be filed within 90 days or as soon as property and premises have been thoroughly cleaned and bleached and the carpets have been replaced. Blah, blah, blah.
He read these lines very swiftly and calmly, as if he was being forced to.
Now, that might sound bad, I know, but there's really nothing to worry about. The animatronic characters here do get a bit quirky at night, but do I blame them? No. If I were forced to sing those same stupid songs for 20 years and I never got a bath, I'd probably be a bit irritable at night too. So remember, these characters hold a special place in the hearts of children and we need to show them a little respect, right? Okay.
Mike found it odd that the guy on the phone message talked about the robots as if they were people. Mike felt the sudden urge to pee, but wanted to wait for the voice message to end. But this guy seemed to drone on for what felt like hours. As the man on the phone continued rambling, the monitor fell asleep and the screen went dark. Mike wiggled the computer mouse around until the screen turned on again.
So just be aware,
the phone guy proceeded.
The characters do tend to wander a bit. They're left in some kind of free roaming mode at night. Something about their servos locking up if they get turned off for too long. They used to be allowed to walk around during the day too, but then there was the bite of 87. Yeah. It's amazing that the human body can live without the frontal lobe, you know?
Mike glanced back at the phone, wondering what the man was even talking about. He was trying his best to pay attention, but felt as though he knew nothing and had to guess what exactly the guy meant. His words felt cryptic.
Now, concerning your safety, the only real risk to you as a night watchman here, if any, is the fact that these characters, if they happen to see you after hours, probably won't recognize you as a person. They'll most likely see you as a metal endoskeleton without its costume on. Now, since that's against the rules here at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, they'll probably try to forcefully stuff you inside a Freddy Fazbear suit.
Mike wondered how advanced the animatronics really were. He had always assumed they simply moved their limbs like puppets on strings. The thought of one being able to detect an endoskeleton and force it into a costume creeped him out.
Now that wouldn't be so bad if the suits themselves weren't filled with cross beams, wires, and animatronic devices, especially around the facial area. So you can imagine how having your head forcibly pressed inside one of those could cause a bit of discomfort and death. The only parts of you that would likely see the light of day again would be your eyeballs and teeth that pop out the front of the mask. Yeah, they don't tell you these things when you sign up. But hey, first station of the breeze. I'll chat with you tomorrow. Check those cameras and remember to close the doors only if absolutely necessary.
The man's tone changed to be more commanding.
Gotta conserve power. Alright, good night.
He concluded. Mike checked the time. It had already been an hour and 30 minutes. He got up and was about to make his way to the bathrooms, but he didn't know where they were. He turned and looked outside the doorway to his right. The place was too dark for him to see anything. Mike sat silently and debated the pros and cons of going to the bathroom. On one hand, he knew he wouldn't hold it in for 4 more hours, but on the other hand, he didn't want to interact with the robots. He leaned down and pressed the key to view the camera showing the stage. He looked closely at the animatronic mascots to analyze the threat. How powerful really were these things anyway? They looked creepy at night, standing still like statues. Freddy's mouth was hung open slightly. The bird robot's beak looked more pointy at this angle. They all appeared more dirty and disgusting, as if they hadn't been washed in years. There were visible stains on the felt. Mike couldn't tell if the darkness and graininess of the camera made them look worse, or if all the lights on stage during the day made them look better. He laughed softly. Looking at the robots made him feel a lot more calm and easy. They didn't look very threatening. Yeah, no way that is gonna stuff me into some suit, he thought to himself. Worst comes to worst, I'll just kick their asses. I mean, it's either them or me. He clicked around on the F keys until he spotted the bathrooms. He remembered exactly which hallway they were in. He had simply forgot from his brief visit there earlier. The lobby was still illuminated by the moonlight, as well as several nearby streetlights. There was a Freddy Fazbear plush on the counter facing his direction. Mike turned to the middle hallway and peered down it. Sure enough, the bathrooms were there. There was a retro flat art poster of the 4 animatronics just above the front desk. Mike read their names quickly to learn. The brown bear was Freddy Fazbear, as he suspected. The purplish rabbit was Bonnie the bunny, and the yellow bird was Chica the chicken. There was one more character apparently named Foxy the pirate that he hadn't seen yet, though he appeared to be a red fox with an eye patch, a hook for a hand, and a gold tooth. He proceeded down the hall and into the bathroom. There were several identical decorations of wooden slices of pizza, as well as whole pizzas. Other than these, there wasn't much decor. There was a private disabled bathroom, which Mike normally would have preferred using if anyone else was there, but because no one else was in the building, it didn't matter. He preferred privacy, so being in the public restroom when no one else was there didn't make a difference. He opened the men's restroom door and stepped inside. The bright fluorescent lights instantly activated, and Mike quickly squinted. He opened his eyes as he wandered around. The urinals were too short for him, so he walked over to the last stall in the row and proceeded to urinate. As he did, the bathroom door swung open loudly. Mike's head turned. "Hello?" he called out into the bathroom. His voice echoed. When Mike finished up, the automatic toilet flushed loudly. The sound bounced off the walls. Mike's heart started to drop a little bit, realizing how weird it was that the door opened. No one else was supposed to be there. He decided to peek through the stall door crack. His heart dropped even further when he saw what was at the other side of the bathroom. "Oh shit," he whispered. Bonnie the bunny was standing just in front of the bathroom door, staring straight into Mike's soul. He could feel the rabbit animatronic's cold gaze like it was a laser beam. The robot was far more disturbing up close. On the camera and on stage, they didn't appear threatening, but being this close, Mike realized firsthand how tall and imposing they really were. Bonnie towered over Mike. Mike knew he had to be at least 7 feet tall. The lack of eyebrows made his expression look dull. It disturbed Mike. Remembering everything the man on the phone had said, Mike worried a little bit. The robot was huge, but it seemed to be standing still. Mike slowly opened the stall door just a crack. Bonnie still didn't move. Mike stepped out of the stall. Nothing. The animatronic was completely stagnant. Mike found himself walking closer to him, feeling less afraid. He raised his hand and started waving his fingers around. Suddenly, Bonnie turned his head toward Mike's hand. Bonnie's eyes focused on his fingers. Mike's eyes widened. He backed up a little bit. Bonnie marched toward him slowly. Mike instantly stumbled back into the stall and shut the door. He stayed in the corner. Bonnie stopped just outside and remained there for several minutes. Mike got tired of standing in the corner and had to sit down. He stared at Bonnie's legs. His feet had only 3 large toes. His head reached the top of the stall, and his ears were nearly at the bathroom ceiling. "It's over for me if that thing can crawl under here," Mike thought anxiously. No, that thing is way too big to fit under the stall." Out of nowhere, Bonnie turned around and gave up, walking away. Mike got up as soon as he heard the bathroom door swing closed. He carefully opened the stall door and stepped out. Washing his hands was the last thing on his mind. Mike pushed the bathroom door. It creaked loudly. He turned to the left and right. He didn't hear or see Bonnie anywhere. He decided to run to the right and back to the lobby. He ran down another hall and slowly tiptoed until he made his way to where the office was. Mike scanned around the corridor near his office and couldn't see anything. He sat back in the chair. It didn't take long for Mike to get bored enough to do his job. He shook the computer mouse to wake up the monitor. When it turned on, he clicked the key to view the show stage room. He noticed that Bonnie was back on the stage in the exact same position and stance as before, except his guitar was missing. Mike leaned back in the seat and breathed deeply. "What am I freaking out over, a big bunny?" he asked himself in his mind. Though he thought about how large the animatronic was, he remembered its creepy blank stare. Yeah, I am freaking out over a bunny," he continued. "That thing is the size of a damn NBA player." However, nothing significant happened for the next hour. Mike sat still and waited for something to happen. This gave him plenty of time to ease his nerves. Every few seconds he checked the time. Though the watch pot didn't boil, the more he looked at the clock, the slower time seemed to move. He groaned out loud and kicked off of the desk to spin his chair. It was something he found fun ever since he was a child, and even at the age of 37, he still found amusement in it. When he was done staring off into space and spinning in his chair, he checked the time. 3:25 a.m. He still had 2 hours and 35 minutes to kill. He woke up the monitor and began looking around Freddy's. Next to the time on the screen was a meter labeled power. It was at 60%. As Mike watched, it dropped to 59%. Under it was a small label that said usage and displayed a green battery icon. Mike realized that despite doing nothing, he had wasted over 40% of the power he was given. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary on the camera, so he laid his head down on the desk for a few minutes. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but couldn't. With nothing entertaining or stimulating for Mike, he thought about leaving. Boredom was agonizing. However, he knew that if he left, he would be caught on camera, and he'd be fired. The last thing he wanted was to go through the trouble of finding another job, especially when sitting around doing nothing was preferable to hard labor. He checked the cameras once more to make sure everyone was in their proper places, but Mike shuddered when he realized both Chica and Bonnie were off the stage. Freddy hadn't moved an inch. Mike stood up and leaned out the right doorway. No one was in the hall. He maneuvered past the chair and peered out the left side. He spotted the silhouette of Bonnie not moving. Mike receded back into his office and sat in confusion about what he was supposed to do. The big square door and light buttons next to each doorway stuck out to him. He clicked the door button on the left side, and suddenly an electronically moving door slid down from the ceiling. Mechanical sounds emitted from the process. Both the top and the bottom of the door had black and yellow diagonally striped tape, and the door seemed to be made of metal. Mike had expected it to function more like an elevator door and found it mildly funny that it came down from the ceiling. He looked out the window into the hall, but it seemed to be permanently fogged up. He pressed his eyes against the glass and cupped his hands around to stop light from reflecting. Mike still couldn't get a good look, so he clicked the door light. Mike jumped back and gasped when he saw Bonnie's huge head pressed against the glass. His legs got caught on the wheels of his chair. He tripped and fell on his back. Still looking up at the disturbing mascot staring at him, he stood up and looked around, making sure nothing else could get in. He struggled to take his eyes off of Bonnie. Mike felt the animatronic's sharp gaze stay on him. He couldn't help but stare back. It took a long time, but finally Mike watched as Bonnie turned around and walked back down the hallway. He looked at the power usage. He had only 36% of the electricity left. He noticed it drained faster while the door was closed. He pressed the door button again, hoping the loud sound of the door moving up wouldn't attract any animatronics. Thankfully it didn't. Mike saw Bonnie walk back to the show stage on the camera. Beforehand, Mike was starting to wonder if he should just use his job to sleep at and collect payment, but now that was out of the question. He kept observing the monitor every few minutes to make sure nothing was headed toward his office. Freddy and Bonnie were still on stage. Chica, however, hadn't returned. Mike clicked through the different cameras until something caught his attention, something yellow moving in his vision. He looked up. Chica was just outside the office. Her entire body was pressed against the glass of the right hall's window. Her beak was now hung open and wide. Her eyelids were rolled back into her head, so therefore her eyes looked very big. Mike jumped up and slammed the door button. The right side door slowly started shutting. Chica didn't move. She stayed against the glass, mouth and eyes wider than Mike knew possible. He wished there were blinds he could shut, though there were none, and he simply had to endure this. As disturbed as Mike was, he struggled to fully grasp the depth of the situation in his somewhat tired state of mind. He looked at the clock again. It was almost 6 a.m., but Chica still wasn't moving. Mike waited and waited, the power meter going down ever so slowly. He now only had 16% of it left to work with, but out of the blue, when he least expected it, the sound of a grandfather clock chimed. The charming sound reverberated through the building. All the lights turned on. Chica's eyelids rolled back down halfway over her eyes. Her mouth closed. She turned around and instinctively walked back to the stage. Mike looked at the clock. 6 a.m. He breathed a sigh of relief before walking away. He saw Chica standing at the end of the hall, scanning him. As she watched him leave, her eyelids narrowed down into a somewhat angry expression. There were brief flashes in Susie's mind of things happening, but the events were out of order. She remembered only bits and pieces of everything that had occurred. First was the slides and the plastic tunnels full of children. She remembered the slides ending in a ball pit. Every single plastic ball was lively. The colors from her memory were so oversaturated that they almost burned to think about. Susie couldn't remember if the place was really this bright, or if this is how she recalled it being so young. She thought about the stage with Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica. They all sang beautifully together, but on that day, their music and the cheering of kids blended into a mix of sounds that was anything but melodic. Susie then remembered a new animatronic she had never seen before appear from behind her. It was of a golden rabbit, though thinner and smaller than most of the animatronics. Susie was amazed upon first noticing him. The felt on his suit was a bright shade of yellow. Instead of a red bow tie, this mascot wore a purple one. The next thing she remembered was holding the golden bunny's hand as they walked somewhere else in the building. But everything else was blocked out and forgotten. The next thing she knew, she was here, back again at this place. But everything was dim and stained, aged with time. Mike moved the controls of the forklift around to lift large crates. The crates would be placed onto the prongs, and Mike would use the machine to mechanically lift them up and slowly drive them forward. The floor was concrete and the whole building was made of metal. The visual contrast between the children's pizzeria arcade and this industrial setting was noticeable for Mike. While working, he thought about the animatronics' faces. They were all creepy, but he found Bonnie to be the worst. His dull expression cut through Mike, the lack of emotion in his face partially due to having no eyebrows. While brooding the events of the previous night, Mike accidentally crashed into an aisle of metal boxes. Luckily, they didn't tip over. He looked around to make sure no one saw. Sure enough, everyone else was too busy sorting items to notice, so he turned the forklift to the left and kept moving forward, activating the alarm. The beeping noise warned everyone to make sure they were out of the way as Mike cruised down the rest of the aisle. Everyone got to the side instinctively. As he maneuvered around, he still couldn't get the images of the robots out of his head. Chica's stare was chilling too. He remembered her wide eyes and open mouth as she stood outside the right office window. Mike looked around and realized he was now in the wrong aisle. He turned around and the workers were confused. "Shit!" he cursed. Frustrated with all the errors he made that day, he tried to turn the forklift around as quickly as possible. He moved it over to the side of the aisle where the boxes needed to be and lowered them. There was a slight burning sensation in his eyes that made working more stressful. He knew the feeling, the lack of sleep and staring at screens for far too long. As soon as he was done, his boss dismissed him. "Mike, you can go home now," he said, sipping his coffee. Mike nodded and started navigating the forklift in the direction of its designated parking spot. He accidentally forgot to press the alarm at first, and one worker almost got in the way. Mike stopped abruptly. "What the hell, man?" the worker yelled. "Sorry," Mike replied. He turned on the alarm and proceeded to drive it back to its spot. He took the key out, dropped it off in the office, and walked to his car. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment and closed his eyes. It was the first moment he had away from both of his jobs, and all he wanted to do was rest. But he still had to drive home. He reluctantly turned the key in the ignition of his car and traveled down the gravel pathway, away from the warehouses. Only on that drive did things really start to set in. Mike finally had a moment to himself to think clearly. He recalled what the man on the phone said about the animatronics stuffing people into suits and the potential risk of death. How could that be? He couldn't physically imagine some robotic rabbit being able to overpower him, but its size was considerable. He tried to rationalize it, and assumed it might have been some sort of precaution, as if to tell people to stay away from the robots because of their odd behavior. With only 4 hours of sleep, this was the best explanation he could come up with to shrug it off. "This pizza don't taste right," Howard remarked. He threw his slice of pizza back onto the paper plate, done with it. Linda agreed. "I know, right? It's not the same as the recipe back in the 80s. This tastes like cardboard." Ted and Tony continued to eat theirs as though they heard nothing. "Well, the kids seem to like it." "Oh, they're in their growth spurt. They'll eat anything," Howard chuckled. He looked around at all the decorations on the wall. Children's drawings, wooden pizzas, and other posters were hung up everywhere, some of them encased in glass frames. However, they were all old or partially torn. The colors on most of the posters had faded over time. One iconic poster stuck out to Howard, a parody of the Abbey Road album cover where the Beatles were replaced with the Freddy's mascots. That night, the guest turnout was low. Freddy's was almost desolate. There were only a few small families throughout. Howard remembered the absolute roaring of children from the 80s, how crowds of kids would surround single arcade machines at a time, even in the late hours. He remembered how the robots used to walk around and interact with kids. Now the restaurant was quiet, especially in the evenings. The sounds of a few children playing arcade games were faint. Small speakers in the corner of the room played old rock music quietly. He found the lack of people to be slightly unnerving. "You know, why don't you guys go play some games?" He reached into his pocket and grabbed his wallet. He fished out several dollar bills. "Here's a couple of dollars. Go trade them for quarters at the machine." "I want to play on the slides," Ted whined. "You can do whatever you want, but you each get $2. When you want your money, just let me know." And with that, Ted ran off to the playroom while Tony darted to the arcade. It took Ted a long moment to crawl up the triangular platforms into the play structure. He had to move under and then over, weaving his way from one to another. Once he made it to the top, he took a moment to catch his breath. He then crawled to the slide and sat down on the very edge. Rather than a curved tube slide, this was a steep, open slide. Ted leaned forward and shot down, crashing into the ball pit. With no employees in the room, he climbed back up the slide instead of using the platforms or ladders. Though it was steep, and with his socks on, he had minimal friction. His fingers accidentally slipped off halfway, and he ended up falling back down the slide. He got up and decided to rush into the next room. The red curtain was covering the stage. The rows of tables in front were completely empty. Ted found himself alone here. He crept up to the stage and looked back to make sure no one was watching before pulling open the curtain. He eyed the animatronics. They were all standing as still as statues. Freddy jolted his head to face the boy. His eyes were practically invisible in the darkness, but scanners within them lit up. Freddy's eyes appeared as dark spots with tiny white dots of light. Ted jumped back. A second later, the red curtains all electronically moved to the side, and the stage lights turned on. The rest of Freddy's eyes were made visible, and the glowing scanners turned off upon being exposed to the light. Freddy turned his head and faced forward. A piano song started playing loudly. Ted ran back to where the tables were.
"Good morning, kids,"
Freddy said. The animatronic's voice was low and glitchy.
"Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza."
Bonnie opened his mouth.
Are you kids ready to rock? It's your best buddy, Bonnie.
None of their mouths seemed to move to the words correctly.
I'm Chica. Did you kids have a good weekend?
Ted said nothing.
I know, I did. Let's check on Foxy. Oh, Foxy.
Chica called out. Ted turned and looked back at where Pirate's Cove was supposed to be. The entrance to the adjacent sub-room was one large square doorway blocked off by curtains and an out-of-order sign. The shiny violet curtains were covered in white and lavender star outlines.
One more time. Foxy.
Chica yelled loudly. A light in Pirate's Cove flickered for a moment. Ted could hear Foxy creaking and moving, but no voice came out of his speaker. "Foxy is out of order," Peter said, stepping into the room. Ted quickly spun around to face him. "You want to come check on him?" Peter lifted the Pirate's Cove curtain. I'm not really supposed to talk to strangers," Ted murmured, clearly a bit taken aback by Peter's approach. "Foxy is just so lonely these days, and no one comes to play with him." Being so young, Ted felt bad for the animatronic character and figured getting an exclusive peek at Foxy would be cool. He hesitantly walked into Pirate's Cove. Peter stepped in behind him and turned on the lights. The walls in Pirate's Cove were painted blue with a glowing orange sunset. There were several palm trees and islands. A cartoonish pirate ship had been painted in the background, as though it was parked at a dock, and the water at the bottom was dark blue. Foxy stood up, still moving around without saying anything. However, the animatronic's demeanor changed when it laid eyes on Peter. Ted studied the robot. Foxy was slightly shorter than the rest of the mascots. The anthropomorphic dark red fox's legs had no felt or plastic casing. Under his ripped-up brown shorts were simply bare endoskeleton legs with metal feet. His chest had a large tear in the middle, as did both of his arms. His right hand was replaced by a metal hook, and his left hand was bare of any felt. It was just metal, like his legs. He wore a black eye patch. Several of his teeth were gold. His ears were rounded but pointy at the ends. His head seemed to have fur that came off the sides. His snout was a brighter shade of red, as was his belly. 3 thin pieces of felt protruded from the top of his head to represent hair. Metallic whirring rang out as the animatronic's eyes tried to focus. His eyes were a very bright shade of orange that light reflected off of. "Can he ever talk again?" Ted asked. "We had to deprogram his daytime routine so his inner speakers shut off. But at night, I hear he hums to himself." Peter looked down at Ted. Before the man could say another word, Foxy rushed at Peter. He leaned down and bit the man's shoulder, sinking his teeth in deeply. Peter groaned loudly and tried to push the animatronic off of him. Ted watched with worried eyes and then raced out of the room. Peter leaned away, shoving Foxy as much as he could. He eventually had to punch Foxy's head, and eventually his jaw opened and he stopped in his tracks. Peter stepped out from behind the curtains, clutching his shoulder. "See, that's why he's out of order," he snickered. Some of the teeth had punctured through his skin. He turned around, but Ted was gone. Peter pulled open the curtain. Foxy was now facing him, his eyebrows narrowed. Peter was confused. Why was the animatronic acting so strange? It wasn't programmed to do this. He used his wounded arm to turn off the light and close the curtains, leaving Foxy in total darkness. When Mike awoke, his mouth was dry and he had a headache. The first thing he did was check the time. It was 10:40. He disabled his alarm and tried to fall back asleep, but he heard Corey talking. "Yeah, he's here," his roommate said. Mike figured this is probably why he woke up. Corey walked into the room and turned on the light. Mike instinctively covered his eyes. "What the fuck, man?" he groaned. "Your wife is on the line." Mike got up and followed Corey into the living room. "She's not my..." he sighed, not wanting to have to explain himself. He picked up the phone, which was dangling by the cord. "Hello?"
"So you didn't tell me you were living at Corey's?"
his ex-wife said vindictively. "Yeah, so sue me," Mike sarcastically replied, not wanting to have to deal with any of his ex-wife's attitude.
"Well, I've been trying to get a hold of you for days now, and it's taken this long."
"Okay, why are you even calling anyway?"
"I just wanted to confirm that you're picking up Mia from school and bringing her back at 8.
"Yeah," Mike laughed. "It's not like that's been the arrangement for..." Corey watched him and shook his head. Mike picked up on his roommate's subtle gesture and knew he was right. There was no reason to dig this hole any deeper than it needed to be. It would only cause trouble for himself. "Yeah, see you at 8, Mike said. He hung up right after. "I thought you hated when people hang up on you without saying goodbye," Corey commented curiously. "Oh, I do." Mike sat on the couch. "It's annoying. That's why I did it just now." Knowing he wasn't going to fall back asleep, he continued sitting down and turned on the TV. Corey walked into the kitchen and came back with a bottle of tequila. "Well, since you're up right now, might as well, right?" Mike shook his head. Man, come on, we haven't done this in a minute. I got 2 jobs, I already got a headache, I don't need this when I gotta pick up my daughter tomorrow." Yeah, Corey mocked, pouring himself a shot. After an hour, Mike went to the bathroom to get ready for work. After showering, combing his hair, and brushing his teeth, he walked down the flight of stairs and out of the apartment building. He drove down the highway until he reached the road to Richland High School. Passing it, he made his way downhill toward Freddy's. He parked his car just in front of the restaurant this time, rather than in the middle. He strolled up to the doors and unlocked the one on the right. Mike turned left and slowly tiptoed to his office, making sure there were no animatronics on the way. Once he made it, he sat down in the computer chair and looked at the show stage on the monitor. The animatronics were all in their proper places, and nothing was out of the ordinary. Out of the blue, the phone rang. Mike jumped. He wasn't expecting another call. He assumed the introduction was the only necessary one. After the second ring, the voice message started. Mike leaned back as the man on the phone spoke.
Hello? Hello? you're hearing this and you made it to day 2, congrats. I won't talk quite as long this time since Freddy and his friends tend to become more active as the week progresses. It might be a good idea to peek at those cameras while I talk, just to make sure everyone's in their proper place, you know.
Mike glanced at the monitor. Oh shit, he thought. He saw Bonnie slowly step off the stage in horror.
Interestingly enough, Freddy himself doesn't come off stage very often.
The phone guy continued.
I've heard he becomes a lot more active in the dark, though, so hey, I guess that's one more reason not to run out of power, right? I also want to emphasize the importance of using your door lights. There are blind spots in your camera views, and those blind spots happen to be right outside your doors. So if you can't find something or someone on your cameras, be sure to check the door lights. You might only have a few seconds to react. Not that you would be in any danger, of course. I'm not implying that.
Mike stood up and peered into the left hallway. He couldn't see anything. He then pressed the light button the man on the phone was talking about. The whole hallway lit up, and as soon as he did, Bonnie, who had been standing in the darkness, began swiftly rushing toward him. Mike quickly pressed the door button and watched as the metal door came down slowly. He turned off the light and backed away as Bonnie stood next to the window, creepily watching him.
Also, check on the curtain in Pirate Cove from time to time. The character in there seems unique in that he becomes more active if the cameras remain off for long periods of time. I guess he doesn't like being watched. I don't know. Anyway, I'm sure you have everything under control. Talk to you soon.
The sound of the phone guy adjusting the phone into its place was audible. Mike looked at the small orange sticky note and found the key for Pirate's Cove. He pressed it. A large out-of-order sign stood in front of the purple curtains, which were open slightly. Mike turned to the side and noticed Bonnie was no longer at the office window. He hit the door button and it mechanically and electronically retreated into the ceiling. He stuck his head out just to make sure Bonnie was gone. He sat back down in the chair and watched Bonnie walk onto the stage. However, he noticed Chica was now missing and looked around for her. He clicked through the F keys. One place he came across while glancing at rooms was the parts and service room. It was messy. Mascot heads of Freddy, Chica, and Bonnie ran along the wall. Some of them had eyes, while others didn't. On a table close to the camera, there was a deactivated endoskeleton. Behind this was a dark Freddy Fazbear head, only its bright eyes and teeth could be seen on camera. Mike found this room to be somewhat interesting. After examining it for a moment, he went back to looking around until he found Chica. She was at the end of the bathroom hallway, walking out of the playroom. Her eyes and bib stuck out in the darkness. Mike thought about what the man on the phone said about the character who doesn't like to be watched. He tapped on the key to look at Pirate's Cove again, and the curtains were open even more now. For a split second, he noticed something between them quickly move. The curtains both fell back into place. After a minute of no activity, he peeked through the other cameras. Nothing happened for too long. Mike reached into his pocket and found Mia's Game Boy. He remembered throwing it in his pocket when he was moving out, but wasn't aware that they were still in these pants. He took solace in the fact that he hadn't washed his clothes since moving. Mike turned the device on and picked up where he had left off in Super Mario Land. He had to move it at an angle where the dim light bulb reflected off of the screen to see anything. A long period of time passed as he jumped through levels in the video game. At the end of a level, Mike put the Game Boy down and shook the computer mouse. The monitor woke up and Mike instantly saw Chica walking down the hall, but only a second after the screen powered on, she stopped and suddenly turned to face the camera, as if she knew Mike was observing her. The lights in that hall flickered for a moment. Mike clicked the show stage key. Bonnie was no longer there. Mike soon found him walking past the rows of tables in front of the stage. Mike tapped the Pirate's Cove key. The curtains were now definitely open, and Foxy was peeking his eye through. Mike figured it would be a good idea to let the monitor sleep while set on this camera, so he left it on Pirate's Cove, picked up the Game Boy again, and began playing. In the middle of a boss level, he heard a loud squawking noise come from the computer's speaker. Mike sprung up and once again shook the mouse. The monitor turned on. Foxy's eye was still peeking through the curtains. Nothing had changed in Pirate's Cove. Perhaps letting the monitor fall asleep on Foxy hadn't worked after all. He knew the squawking sound came from one of the audio feeds, but he didn't know exactly where to search. He looked at the bathroom hallway and saw Chica was no longer there. She had to have walked into the lobby. Mike explored through the keys for a camera that showed the lobby, but there wasn't one. None of them faced that area, nor the hallway from there to his office. He stood up and stretched his legs. He pressed the door light button and looked into the left hall. He then did the same with the right hall. It was starting to become a pattern. Check the cameras and then peek outside his office. Mike kept turning his head to the right, expecting to see Chica draw near, but she never did. 2 cameras covered each passageway going from the show stage to his office in the left and right halls. However, none of them covered the intersection between the right side hall and the lobby hall. Therefore, Mike had no way to see if Chica was coming. He looked at the show stage. As he expected, Freddy was there, standing idly. He turned to the 2 cameras in the left hall. The first one showed no one. In the second one, Bonnie was standing extremely close to the camera. Mike spun around and saw him. The large animatronic was just outside his office. It hadn't even moved. It was still glaring into the camera's lens. "Holy shit!" Mike gasped, quickly closing the door. Mike backed up as it slowly came down and blocked Bonnie from entering. Mike turned around, expecting to see Chica coming too. She wasn't anywhere near. That's when he started to realize just how fearful he actually was. The realization brought him back to the reality for a moment. "I'm a man," he thought to himself. "Well, what's at stake here? 6-foot-tall Big Bird waltzing in?" Before he could think about it any further, he viewed Pirate's Cove. The curtains were now mostly open. Foxy was fully exposed. His mouth was open, revealing sharp, pointy teeth. His eye patch was flipped up and both of his pupils were glowing. Mike glanced down at the power meter, fearing he could easily use up the small amount of electricity he was given. 70% of the power remained. He got up and peeked out the left office window. Bonnie was gone. He pressed the door button, but the door didn't go up. The button got stuck inside the system. It made a strange noise when he tried to press it. He had to push it several more times before it actually worked and went up. Mike knew this was a consequence of the building being old. Its wiring likely hadn't been redone in ages, and that's why there was lag on something as simple as pressing the button to open a door. Cobwebs were strewn between several corners, the walls were all dirty and musty, and lights flickered. Paint was faded onto the quickly decaying drywall. Splotches of black and dark gray spread across. It didn't take much inspecting to understand that this was a run-down dive. Most of the posters were all retro and wrinkled up. The animatronics also had dirty, unwashed felt. They were clearly worn out. Mike sat back down in the computer chair, likely the newest and cleanest thing in the room. He contemplated picking up his Game Boy to keep playing, but he was on edge now. He looked around at the cameras. The idea of quitting and walking out at that moment floated through his mind, but the hassle of finding a new job would be way too much. He needed money as soon as possible, and if he just held out to the end of the week, he'd attain just enough to get by. Mike wasn't going through all this fear for nothing. Freddy's was also the only place he applied to that called him back, and he needed to stay there until he could get a new job. All he knew was that he was sure as hell not staying for much longer. What if I'm overthinking it? Mike thought. Maybe I'll get used to it at some point. He leaned back in the chair, taking a deep breath. He checked the time. It was only 3:30 a.m. Mike groaned loudly in agony. He still had 2.5 more hours before his shift was over. He turned to the right. Chica was still nowhere to be found. Mike clicked through all the F keys, looking at every single room he had access to. One of them brought up a black screen. The room label popped up as kitchen. Under that was text that read audio only. Mike could hear pots and pans crashing around. Chica was likely bumping into things. All of a sudden, the sound of humming became audible to him. The humming was low and sounded like an adult male. It echoed loudly through the left hall. Mike scrambled for the sticky note and clicked the show stage key. Freddy and Bonnie stood still. He looked at Pirate's Cove. Foxy was just outside the curtains. His facial features were too dark to see. The whole animatronic appeared as one silhouette, though his eyes were still glowing. His head was tilted all the way to the side, and he held his pirate hook up in the air. Mike stood up and leaned out the left doorway. He pressed the door light. As soon as the light turned on, Foxy started sprinting toward him. Unlike the other animatronics, Foxy was exceptionally fast. He opened his mouth wide as he raced for the office. Mike jerked back in fear and slammed the door button. He walked backwards and watched as the door came down, far too slowly for Mike's liking. By the time Foxy made it to the end of the hallway, it was halfway closed. As it continued to slide down, Foxy began pounding it loudly. Each loud slam frightened Mike more. Foxy wouldn't stop banging on the door as if he was trying to break it down. Mike turned off the door light, hoping Foxy would think no one was there. Just then there were footsteps from right behind him. He spun around and saw Chica at the end of the hall, walking from the lobby to the office. Her eyelids went back into her head as she marched forward. Her mouth drooped open wide. She wasn't as fast as Foxy, but the huge bird still scared Mike. He hit the button to close the right side door. He was now boxed in between a giant creepy chicken and a relentless pirate fox with jagged teeth. There were only thin, flimsy metal doors between him and the horrors. Mike almost wanted to laugh, wondering how his life ended up like this. He constantly looked back and forth between the two windows. There was no escape. Having both of the doors closed used up power quickly. He looked at the time. 5:55 a.m. He was almost done. Having 15% of the power left to his disposal, he decided to leave both doors to his office closed for the rest of the night. Mike dared not touch the Game Boy. He grabbed it and powered it off, not even bothering to save his progress. He was too distracted now. Every small noise made him jump. He eagerly took a quick peek at the cameras. Chica walked back to the stage. However, Foxy was still standing in the hallway, twitching. The animatronic's limbs jolted around, his head tilting sideways. His hook twisted and turned. His movements were quick and erratic. Eventually, the Godfather clock chimed through the building. 6 a.m. had come. Mike looked up as all the lights instantly turned on. Foxy began marching back into Pirate's Cove. The night was over. Mike got up, stretched, and opened the right side door. He walked through the now open doorway and saw Bonnie at the end of the hall to the lobby. Guests were already lining up and the kids were pointing and staring at him. Mike knew the robot wouldn't be able to hurt him in the daytime, so he strolled out, turning his body to pass Bonnie in the narrow hall. Bonnie's head turned to face Mike as he passed. Mike looked back. Its blank stare somewhat intimidated him. Matthew remembered the red curtains from back then. The velvet fabric would swoop down to block the animatronics. Bonnie would announce that the show would return in 5 minutes and a digital timer in the corner of the room would start counting down. Most of the children started leaving the room, needing instant gratification from something to do, and now that Freddy and his friends weren't performing, they'd focus their attention onto something else. But not Matthew. He stayed behind and waited patiently for his favorite characters to return. He continued sitting at his table. Minutes passed. Matthew grabbed a green crayon and a blank piece of paper, deciding to draw as he stood by. He didn't have anything in mind. He simply pressed the crayon against the paper and let his hand flow. He started drawing a stem with leaves coming off of it, the beginning of a flower. Letting the crayon go wherever it wanted on the paper helped him decide what to draw, and when he realized he wanted to draw a flower, he started making a more conscious effort to draw in that direction. He then put the green crayon down and picked up a yellow one. He drew a big yellow circle at the end of the stem and filled it in. He then used black to add dots, and finally he completed it with big red petals as half circles. Psst, he heard. Focusing heavily on his drawing, he didn't hear it at first. Psst, hey! The voice repeated in a hushed whisper. Matthew put the crayon down and looked up at the stage. An animatronic was poking out from the curtains. It was one he hadn't seen before, a bright yellow rabbit with green eyes. He had no idea who this animatronic was, but it fascinated him. He glanced around. No other kids were in the room to see it. He likened the character to Bonnie. The golden bunny mascot emerged, dancing around. He began dance walking while waving Matthew on. "Follow me," he said in a comically deep voice. Matthew stood up and followed him. They both went through the playroom and past the rambunctious children, and then past the cafe. Matthew noticed the golden rabbit mascot stopped dance walking the further he went until they were standing just in front of two big red doors at the end of the arcade. The mascot opened them and tilted his head, signaling Matthew to walk inside. He rushed forward through the open doorway. The room was pitch black. He turned around and heard the door slam behind him. Peter sat back and studied the diner on the cameras. The turnout that day was sparse. There were 2 birthday parties and only 10 separate guests. He watched as children played in the jungle gym, mashed buttons on the arcade games, ate food, and enjoyed Freddy's band singing. He moved the mouse around and accidentally bumped it into something small, the Game Boy Mike had left on the table. Peter picked it up, unfamiliar with the device. Just then, Robert stormed into the office. "Peter!" he said in a demanding voice. Peter looked up at him. "Yes?" he asked calmly. Where the hell were you? I've been looking for you all day." "Car had trouble starting. Had to use my neighbor's jumper cables. Got here at 12. Why? What's up?" "Where the hell is the, whatever you call it, the golden Freddy?" I don't know. Our technician said they brought it into parts and service, but I haven't seen it. Come on, we're trying to get that one up and going. Don't tell me it just disappeared on us." "I don't know what else to tell you," Peter shrugged. "Maybe ask the new guy, whatever his name is, the Nightside guy. Maybe it was stolen." "Well, no money from the register's gone. Nothing else is missing. There's no reason why anyone would break in and steal a random bear suit in the back. That thing's as old as time itself. But I'll keep my eye out." Robert began walking away. "Oh, and his name's Mike," Peter muttered. He rose up and turned around. There were several tall lockers behind the chair. He opened the one with his name labeled on it. He grabbed his wallet and counted his money, planning to buy a pizza for lunch, though something stuck out in the corner of his eye. The words, "It's me," were clearly drawn in the fog on the small mirror on his locker door. Peter slammed his locker shut. Mike waited in the long line of cars outside the elementary school. He remembered picking up Mia from here every day. It was always such a hassle. At times it felt damn near impossible. The sky took on a light shade of blue and the wind breezed through the small nearby trees. Cars inched forward only every so often. He scanned the premises until he finally saw Mia standing by herself next to a tree on the other side of the parking lot. Mike put up his turn signal and drove left into the road. He accidentally pulled out in front of a car that was already driving and it almost collided with his. It honked as it swerved around him. Mike went down the road and then turned right into a nearby intersection and parked near the buses. "Mia! Hey!" he yelled. He whistled. Mia glanced around and noticed him. With excited eyes, she ran over to him. Mike felt heartwarmed to see the joy on her face. "Dad, I forgot it was Wednesday." "It's okay, hop in. How's your day?" Mike sensed his eye twitch slightly. He was familiar with this, the consequences of not enough sleep. "Good," she replied. "Can we go to the trampoline park or the children's gym?" "Wherever we go, you gotta get your homework done," Mike commanded playfully. "I heard you haven't been getting it done here, and it's my fault. I like taking you to the park, Chuck E. Cheese's, the mall, and all these places, but I need to be on top of your schoolwork. I'm sorry I haven't done that much." "It's okay," Mia said instantly. "I don't care where we go, I just want to see you." Mike smiled warmly as he backed up into the street, this time making sure there were no cars coming before moving. "Oh, I got a new job, by the way." "What is it?" "I work at some pizza place, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza." "Pizza? I want some pizza. Can we go there? I want to see..." Mike was now faced with a problem. He knew he'd likely get discounted food and Mia would have a good time playing on all the equipment. Going there would be perfect. But with the animatronic's constant erratic behavior, it was questionably unsafe. By that point though, Mike had long forgotten most of the night. His attention span wasn't particularly long due to his exhaustion, so without much thought he started driving to Freddy's. "You know, I don't see why not. No pizza until 5 though." "What? Come on," Mia pleaded. "You just ate a few hours ago. Let your stomach rest." "But I'm still hungry." "Fine. No pizza until you get your schoolwork done." Mia looked out the window as Mike drove. After cruising down a long stretch of road, Mike turned left and then into the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza parking lot. Mia eyed the diner in awe. "Alright, we're here. Just don't run too far away from me." "I won't," she agreed. They stepped out of the car and walked toward the building. Mia admired all the decor in the vestibule. Mike recognized the employee at the register. To his dismay, it was May, the lady with the blue hair who acted a little strange in their first interaction. "Hey, we'd like to... be here," Mike stated awkwardly, not knowing what to expect. "Yeah, I needed to quickly sign this form," May explained. "Dad, look!" Mia tugged on his pants to get his attention. Mike glanced to the side. She was pointing at the playroom with excitement. "Hold on," he told her. He skimmed through the waiver. He was so tired that he had trouble processing the formal technical statements. At the bottom, he mindlessly signed his name. "Okay, so the arcade will be to your right," May pointed, "and the playroom is up ahead, but I assume you already know that." "Yup," Mike nodded. "What's over there?" Mia pointed at the left hall. "That's my office, where I work." "Ooh, I want to go." Mike nodded and led the way. They walked through the corridor and into the hall leading to the office. Both doors to it were open, and Peter was watching the monitor. "So, this is my office. I work nights. This is the day shift guy." Mia looked around. The lights were on in both hallways going up to it, but the light in the office itself was still very dim. "I like your tie," Mia said, commenting on Peter's shiny purple tie. He continued staring at the monitor as though he had heard nothing. Mike looked at Mia and shrugged. "What an asshole," Mike grumbled. Mia heard and had to chime in. "Language!" "Sorry." "What a jackass." After turning down a few halls, they made it to the show stage room. "This drawing is pretty," she said, pointing at a crayon drawing of a red flower. It was pinned diagonally to the wall. Mia looked at the stage, which was blocked by the shiny red curtain. The rows of tables in front were entirely empty. Mike plopped himself down onto a bench connected to the nearest table. The place looked deserted. He was about to advance to the playroom when he heard footsteps from behind. Mike turned around and saw Peter walking his way. Peter's face was void of any emotion. Mike watched as he pressed a large red button on the wall. The stage curtains instantly opened up, swinging to both sides to reveal the 3 animatronics. The Toreador March began playing on the overhead speakers. Their robotic eyelids rolled up as they awoke. Mia ran close to the stage, finding the animal characters amusing. Mike watched worriedly. He didn't want to get near them, and he especially didn't want his own daughter to. But they seemed to do no harm.
Hey kids, welcome back to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Are you kids ready to rock?
Yeah! Mia screamed. As she watched the performance start, Mike found himself staring at the red button on the wall. He figured maybe that button was the answer to his never-ending night problems here. If he pressed it, perhaps the animatronics would either stay in day mode, where they wouldn't leave the stage and sit there singing goofy songs, or they might just power off altogether. He knew it would be against the rules since the animatronics were supposed to walk around to keep their robotic joints intact. He remembered what the man on the phone said about their servos locking up. However, Mike didn't care. He was only there to collect a paycheck, and if this were to make his job easier, he would do it in a heartbeat.
Hey, that's my line!
Bonnie said.
You can't just say that.
Oh, Bonnie.
Chica responded.
Don't you know that sharing is caring?
Mike thought the performance was weird and didn't care for it, though Mia was entranced. The animatronic started to sing a song about sharing. The sound system quality was mediocre and the electronic noises were grainy. Mike couldn't understand how children found robotic mascots entertaining. At Mia's age, Mike was swimming in creeks, playing with Hot Wheels, and learning to skateboard. He found those infinitely more fun than watching a robot bear tell him to eat his green beans and share his toys. Peace slowly swept over him as he saw Mia dancing along with their songs. Maybe they're not so bad, Mike thought to himself. He turned his head away from the show stage and gasped when he immediately noticed Peter sitting on the opposite side of the table. "You scared me," Mike laughed. Peter was clearly unamused. "Did anyone come in here last night and steal anything?" he asked. No," Mike responded. "We're missing one of our suits, a golden one, randomly disappeared on us." "Yeah, I don't know anything about that. No one was here last night." "You sure?" Peter asked him in a sarcastic tone, as if the question was rhetorical. He held up Mia's Game Boy. Before Mike could even think to make an excuse, Peter grabbed the screen with his other hand. Using all of his strength at once, he suddenly snapped it in half. It made a loud crunching noise, and the glass and metallic pieces fell onto the table. "Dude!" Mike shouted. "Don't let it happen again." Peter set the broken Game Boy on the table and stormed off. He turned back to Mike. "Also, stay out of my locker!" Mike was furious. He thought about running up to Peter and knocking him out. He imagined chucking the now broken Game Boy at Peter's head. He wanted to call him out and tackle him to the ground. It was so satisfying to imagine, but he looked back at his daughter and was reminded of his goals. He couldn't let impulse take over anymore, the way it did with Daniel on the phone, and ripping his eviction notice to shreds. He needed to do only what was best for her. If sweeping this under the rug and making enough money at the end of the week contributed to custody of his daughter in any way, then Mike would reluctantly let it all slide. He planned on making a case of it if he ever came across any employee with authority over Peter, like Robert. Until then, he'd have to wait. Luckily, there happened to be a large trash can at the end of that table. Mike swept all the shattered remains of the Game Boy screen into it. The sharp pieces of the glass pricked his fingers lightly. Eventually, he grabbed the bottom half of it and used it to push the rest of the glass off of the table and into the garbage bag. Luckily, Mia hadn't witnessed any of this. Freddy and the others wrapped up their song and the curtains closed automatically.
"We'll be back in just 5 minutes!" Bonnie announced.
A large screen in the corner of the room displayed a timer dropping from 4 minutes and 59 seconds. "Hey, let's go look at some of the arcade games," Mike suggested. They walked into the next room where most of the children were crawling through the tunnels and sliding into the ball pit. One kid slid down head first as they entered. Mia looked around, almost overwhelmed by the amount of fun activities to do. "I want to go in this," she said excitedly. "Alright, I'll go order us a pizza right now," Mike told her. Mia immediately ran to the ladder, which was the closest entrance into the structure. Mike trod across the playroom and into the cafe arcade area. It was much louder than the rest of the building. He went straight to the kitchen and looked at the prices for pizza. He knew Mia preferred Hawaiian, but he was not in the mood for it. "Can I get a half Hawaiian, half meat lovers large?" he asked. The employees typed the information into the register. "Your total will be $10.74. Mike pulled a $20 bill out of his pocket, but hesitated. "Wait, I work here. I'm the night shift guy. Do I get a discount or something?" "Oh," the employee typed something else into the register. "That'll come out to $10.74. Mike frowned and handed over the $20 bill. The employee at the register took it and gave him back his change. He grabbed a long metal rod with a number at the end. It coiled at the bottom, creating a stable way for it to stand. He then walked back over to the booths near the entrance to the playroom so he could keep an eye on Mia. Most of the tables were empty, so finding a place to sit wasn't difficult. He sat down, set the rod on the table, and looked for Mia. As he sat there, he came to a sudden realization that the broken Game Boy still had Super Mario Land inside of it, which could still be intact. He gazed back at the kitchen. No one seemed to be coming his way anytime soon, so he got up and jogged through the playroom. He watched his daughter talk to another girl her age in a plastic yellow taxi-shaped tunnel end. The show stage room was still empty. Mike bolted to the trash can and dug the broken Game Boy out of it. Sure enough, the Super Mario Land cartridge was still inside. He was able to retrieve it. The game was perfectly fine. Just as he was about to go back to his table, a door creaked open on its own. He looked around and no one else was in sight. Out of curiosity, he found himself wandering toward it. He stepped inside. It was very cold and dark. He turned on a light and immediately recognized this room from viewing it on the CCTV system. The parts and service room. He stared at all the mascot faces hung up on the wall. Mike was shocked to see an animatronic sitting down in the corner. It was a dark yellow version of Freddy with no eyes. Mike realized this was just an empty mascot costume and not even a robot. Its head was tilted sideways, its mouth hung open, its arms were hanging down at its sides, its back was against the wall, knees tucked up into its chest. Mike remembered Peter mentioning a golden suit that had been stolen. He leaned down to the costume and was about to reach into the mouth to pick it up. Someone behind him said, "I wouldn't touch that if I were you." Mike spun around. May stood in the open doorway. "That's a springlock suit." "What?" Mike asked. Back in the 80s, they used these specially designed suits. They were mascot costumes that would turn into robots if you clicked on certain levers in the back of the neck. May leaned closer to the empty suit and reached for the back of its neck. She clicked two small metal beams together and the suit started twitching aggressively. Speakers within it started playing a distorted version of the Toreador March melody that sent a chill down Mike's spine. He watched metal parts swiftly click into place within the costume right where he was about to put his hand just a few seconds prior. May had saved him from touching the equivalent of a bear trap, ironically inside of the bear. So there's parts that come together inside of it, or what? May leaned down and clicked the two beams together even closer, and then the springlock suit went limp again. The two beams split back into their original position. The music shut off and the room was silent. They stopped using these because even something as small as moisture could make these things go from suit mode to animatronic mode while the employees were wearing them, and you can imagine how the pieces snapping together would kill you. Mike glanced back at her with a worried look on his face. "How long have you worked here?" "Long enough," May scoffed. Mike maneuvered past her and through the doorway. She followed. "You know you're supposed to keep your kid near you at all times, right?" "Yeah, I'm going," Mike mumbled. As soon as he left the room, he faced the hall with the office at the end of it and yelled to Peter, "I found the golden suit!" He glanced back into the room and the yellow Freddy mascot was no longer there, as if it had just vanished. He stepped back into the room and looked around. Never mind." That wouldn't be the weirdest thing to happen at Freddy's. May was now walking alongside Mike on the way to the cafe. "So you're the night shift guy?" she asked. "How's that?" "Don't you have somewhere to be?" They passed a large series of plastic tunnels in the playroom. "Isn't that your girl over there?" May pointed at Mia, who was swimming in the ball pit with other kids. "Yeah?" "You shouldn't be here," she warned firmly. Her voice up to that point had been somewhat monotone. Mike was thrown off by her cold words. He narrowed his eyebrows, trying to throw off a confused expression. "It's not a safe job," she added. "Well, I'm staying, at least to the end of the week. I have rent to help pay, food to buy, and I'm not doing this all for nothing." "Of course," May said in a neutral tone. "Everyone has a reason to come here, but no one has a reason to stay." Before Mike could say another word, May abruptly walked away. He was partially creeped out by the woman's tone. He hadn't had any social interactions go as strangely as this. He found it partly funny, but was still kind of unnerved. He shook his head and looked back at the playroom, which was now behind him. Man, there are some real weirdos working here, Mike thought. First, Peter won't take the time to look in Mia's direction, and now there's this blue-haired freak acting like that. He couldn't wait for the week to be over so he could leave and never return. After 15 minutes, Mia rushed back to the table where Mike was sitting. An employee had brought the pizza only minutes before, and Mia worked up an appetite from playing on all the toys and equipment for so long. "Where'd you put your backpack?" Mike asked. "By my shoes in the shoe cubby." "Go get it. While we eat, we gotta do homework. Come on." She had hoped that Mike would forget about it, but he didn't. After rolling around in bed for 4 hours, unable to fall asleep, Mike looked at the alarm clock. It was finally nearing 11:30. He could hear Corey continue to mix sounds on turntables in the living room. This racket is why he couldn't fall asleep, but Corey was generous enough to let him live here for free, so Mike didn't complain. He disabled his alarm before it could go off and got out of bed. He was coated in a light layer of sweat. He opened the window and let the cool autumn night air in. He wished he had done that before trying to sleep, but it was too late now. He took a clean outfit with him to the bathroom, showered, and changed. When he got out, Corey was still mixing sounds on the couch. "Have you come up with a name yet?" Mike asked as he made a bowl of cereal. "I don't know, I'm thinking of exotic something. Maybe Corey Exotic." Mike shook his head, laughing. "That's stupid." He moved his arm to grab a spoon and accidentally knocked a box off the table. 2 wrapped sticks of butter fell out. "Shit," he muttered. Mike bent down to pick up the butter and shuffled the sticks back into the box. "I got it," Corey chimed. "Exotic Butters." Mike shrugged, still thinking this was a dumb name, though he knew he couldn't come up with anything better. They discussed this briefly as Mike finished his cereal. When he tossed his empty paper bowl into the trash can, he noticed the garbage was now overflowing. He sighed, knowing what he had to do. Mike pulled out the 2 ends of the bag. He tied them together and yanked it out of the can. He looked at the oven, which had a clock on it, and noticed it was now time for him to leave. "I'm gonna take out the trash on the way out," he noted. Corey nodded. Mike lifted the heavy bag out of the room. He silently made his way downstairs into the alleyway between apartment buildings where the dumpsters were all lined up. It was so cold outside that Mike could see his own breath. He opened the dumpster lid. The foul smell of garbage blasted him. He immediately threw the bag inside and closed it, facing away from the dumpster. When he got to his car, he slouched against the leather seat, wanting to close his eyes and pass out. He had gone without sleep for 24 hours. With 5 hours ahead of him at Freddy's and 8 hours at the warehouse, he was already beyond exhausted. "No, I have a job to do," Mike chided himself. He started his car and floored it out the parking lot. He tried to drive as carefully as possible, knowing how sleep-deprived he was. Once he made it to Freddy's, he accidentally parked in the disability spot. He only realized this upon getting out and was too tired to re-park. Being an employee of the place, he knew he wouldn't receive any punishment for it. A slap on the wrist at best. Mike opened the door and walked into his office. He looked at the camera facing the show stage. The animatronics were all standing still. He clicked the Pirate's Cove camera key. Foxy was standing just behind the curtains, peeking one of his eyes out through. A second after Mike clicked on this camera, Foxy immediately moved back, and the curtain he was holding open fell closed. As Mike looked closely at the screen, the phone rang. He was expecting it, but it still made him jump a little. After just a few rings, the message rolled.
Hello?
The man on the phone seemed to have the same intro for every call, repeating hello as if he couldn't tell the recorder was on. Mike found it annoying.
Hey, you're doing great. Most people don't last this long. I mean, you know, they usually move on to other things by now. I'm not implying that they died. That's not what I meant. Anyway, I better not take up too much of your time. Things start getting real tonight.
The way the phone guy said this made Mike stop and think. Getting real, Mike asked himself. What's that supposed to mean?
Hey, listen, I had an idea.
The phone guy continued.
If you happen to get caught and want to avoid getting stuffed into a Freddy suit, try playing dead. You know, go limp. Then there's a chance that maybe they'll think that you're an empty costume instead. Then again, if they think you're an empty costume, they might try to stuff a metal skeleton into you. I wonder how that would work. Yeah, never mind. Scratch that. It's best just not to get caught. Okay, I'll leave you to it. See you on the flip side.
Well, that was informative, Mike thought sarcastically. No wonder most people don't last this long. This place is weird. He sat back in his chair and let out a disappointment-filled sigh. He watched the cameras, waiting for things to happen. No one moved for a while. A little less than an hour into his shift, Mike remembered the red button Peter had pressed earlier that day to activate the animatronics. He recalled the idea he thought of back then, that if he pressed the button it might turn the animatronics to day mode, and therefore they wouldn't hurt him. He perked up and started searching the camera for this button, to make sure it was where he remembered it. Sure enough, it was just at the end of the left hall, straight from his office to the show stage room. Mike stood up and turned on the left door light. "Do I really want to do this?" he asked, peeking down the corridor. He turned off the light, knowing it might attract any animatronics that could be near. With a sudden burst of confidence, he raced into the hall, tiptoeing to the end. He made sure to look around at every passing area. The button was now just in front of him. He glanced around. The robotic mascots were blocked by the closed curtains, and none of them had come off the stage yet. He glanced at Pirate's Cove, which was within the same room. Not a single sound resounded through the building, so in one swift motion, Mike pushed the button. Suddenly, 2 loud thuds sounded out. A rusty carousel in the corner of the room turned on and started spinning. Circus music played. The classical song sounded happy and cheerful. The curtains immediately opened electronically, slamming to the sides of the stage. The robots were now visible. They all began twitching violently. Mike watched nervously as the scanners in their eyes turned on. Their eyes were now glowing. Freddy's head jerked and spasmed around, but his eyes stayed locked onto Mike's. Loud electronic noises started playing on the speakers, and the colorful lights were moving around quickly. The carousel spun faster and faster, lighting up as the tune of the music became faster as well. An electric popping noise sounded out, and the carousel turned off completely. The animatronics stopped twitching, the lights all turned off, and the curtains swung back down into place. The room was as dark as usual. The sudden noises and erratic behavior of the robots made every hair on Mike's body stand up. He turned around and sprinted back to the office. He frantically checked all the cameras repeatedly. He closed both doors and sat in silence. His thoughts raced as his breathing remained rapid. He kept looking in all directions to make sure nothing was outside his office. Seeing the animatronics glitch, watching the robotic bear stare into his soul, and hearing the happy music get more intense deeply unsettled him. Mike glanced at the power meter. With both doors down, electricity was running out fast. Therefore, Mike let the monitor go into sleep mode. He sat in silence, trying to process everything he just saw. The scene made him uneasy. After many minutes of anxious boredom, he shook the mouse to check the cameras again. He was already down 50% of the power. The animatronics hadn't moved. He checked Pirate's Cove. Nothing. Upon seeing nothing else as crazy happen, Mike became relieved. He figured pressing the button must have reset him. This plan had worked. Now they wouldn't come for him. His heart started beating regularly again, and he began to calm down. Everything in the vicinity stood still. Mike rested his head against the table, now extra tired from worrying. Without thinking for much longer, Mike closed his eyes with both doors shut. And it closed down 10 years ago, Zach stated, driving into an available parking spot just in front of the building. He noticed someone else's car in the disability spot. He looked to Colin in the passenger seat, who shrugged. Probably someone in the area who just left their car here overnight, Colin said, unbuckling his seatbelt. I do that shit all the time. I left my car parked at KFC like a million times. Nothing happens. The two opened their doors and stepped outside the car. They studied the scene. Freddy Fazbear's pizza remained still. There seemed to be no sign of life. Colin grabbed a small wire and walked up to the door. He jammed it inside. Zach waited as Colin worked his magic. He pressed the wire against several pins, but couldn't seem to get them all unlocked at once. Damn it, he muttered, struggling. He pulled the wire out and bent it differently. Zach waited anxiously. Come on, we don't have all night. What if someone sees us? Shut up, Colin yelled out of frustration. He decided to slowly move the wire past all the pins until he reached the shear line. He was surprised when he opened the door, and it actually worked. He knew rake picking was a less common method since it required low-quality locks. When it finally opened, he and Zach rushed in. They quietly tiptoed through the vestibule and into the lobby. The building still smelled of pizza that had been cooked earlier that day. Zach took a heavy-duty flashlight out of his duffel bag and turned it on. The two crept to the counter and looked through the drawers. Where's the register? Zach asked. Colin shushed him quickly. Shh! Can you be any louder? He whispered angrily. It's clearly not here, but they sell pizzas in the kitchen, right? There's a register there. Zach nodded. They carefully walked down the hall to the arcade. Zach's flashlight illuminated the entire room. He had to turn the dial on it to focus the light in a smaller area so as to be inconspicuous. As Colin peered around the room for equipment to steal, Zach found himself at the cash register. He pressed a button to open it, and something in the view of his flashlight caught his attention. A big cupcake with wide eyes, sitting on the countertop. He nearly gasped when he saw it. Zach focused on it for a second, finding it odd. He reached down to pick it up. As soon as he touched it, he was shocked with static electricity. He finally grabbed it and held it in his hand. The personified cupcake was much heavier than he expected. Its eyes were like that of the animatronic characters, but brown. Its buck teeth were big. He set it back down, and something yellow caught his eye. He aimed the flashlight up to see Chica the chicken standing in front of him on the other side of the counter, only inches away. The fuck? He screamed. Colin, who was previously trying to pry open the quarter exchange machine with a crowbar, whipped his head around to see what was going on. In one swift motion, Chica violently pulled Zach over the desk. The flashlight fell out of his hand, and he yelled. Zach! Colin rushed over to the counter but couldn't see anything. He held his crowbar out in front of him to use as a weapon.
Hey there, buddy.
Bonnie said from behind him. He swung the crowbar just in front of him but didn't hit anything. But the distorted nature of the voice, he could tell it was one of the animatronics. "Zach!" Colin shouted, more afraid now. He began jogging until he reached the playroom. He turned around and gazed at the arcade behind him. His eyes were slowly growing used to the dark. "I'm leaving without you," he called back. He swiftly ran to the hall leading to the lobby, but someone blocked his path. He recognized the mascot by his silhouette. His ears and top hat were almost iconic.
Where do you think you're going, buddy?
Freddy asked, slowly stepping toward Colin. "Fuck off," he said. He stuck the crowbar in front of him, but his hands were trembling. Freddy leaned down in half a second, his mouth opening wide. A loud scream from his speaker sounded out. Though Colin was quick, he was able to catch Freddy. With all his strength, he forced the animatronic bear's jaw open as much as he could. Freddy was desperately trying to bite, but Colin was able to stop him. Freddy then reached down and grabbed his shirt. Colin was taken aback by how humanoid his mannerisms were. It was uncanny. He continued to fend off the animatronic bear. He pressed his hand against Freddy's right eye, pushing him back from attacking. For some reason, a foul stench emitted from Freddy's mouth, as if he had bad breath. Colin eventually pushed as hard as he could, forcing Freddy's head back as he stumbled out of the animatronic's strong grip and onto the floor. He jumped to his feet instantly and sprinted back into the playroom. He could now fully see in the dark. Bonnie stood in the arcade doorway. Colin had no other choice but to rush for the show stage room. He noticed an open door into a room labeled Parts and Service. He figured animatronics can't open doors with handles, so he bolted straight for it. He shut the door behind him and heavily breathed out. He looked around and jumped back when he saw a Foxy the Pirate mascot suit sitting on the big table. Though it looked different. Its jaw was more triangular and its ears were torn. It was shaking slightly, and Colin could hear whimpers from the inside. "Zach?" he asked worriedly. "Help me." Zach's voice was weak. Colin could tell he was in the mascot suit, but something wasn't right. Zach, come on, we gotta go." Zach continued to cough and gag. Colin tried to yank the head off the costume, but it had been clicked into place somehow. Something warm oozed onto his hands. He looked down. Blood. Before he could process anything he was experiencing, he noticed the lights flicker in the corner. He jerked his head to the left and saw one of the robots, an eyeless golden bear he had never seen before. It seemingly appeared in the corner of this room from out of nowhere and jumped out at him. The sound of someone screaming became apparent as Mike started to realize he was awake. He jolted up and looked around. Nothing was different. He figured the scream was from a nightmare he had, one that he couldn't remember. Mike laid his head back down, wanting to continue sleeping, but after a few more minutes of laying on the desk, he got bored enough to fully wake up. He looked at the time. It was 5:37. He then checked the power meter. He had 4% of it left to use. Not that he cared. He figured the worst case scenario would be that the doors would stay closed and couldn't open until 6 a.m. Mike glanced around at the cameras and raised his eyebrows when he saw all of the animatronics were missing from the stage. He looked through the other rooms anxiously. Bonnie was standing up in the Parts and Service room next to the table. There seemed to be a spare red mascot suit sitting behind him. The animatronic rabbit was staring firmly into the camera. His mouth hung open slightly.
Hey everyone, it's your best buddy Bonnie,
Bonnie said excitedly. Mike could hear his voice in the distance. Watching the Parts and Service room camera, he could see Bonnie's mouth moving up and down to the words coming out of his inner speaker.
Hey there, Bonnie.
Chica responded. Her voice was much louder, and Mike knew she was closer.
I'm Chica. Let's eat.
Mike stood up and turned on the right door light. As he suspected, Chica was standing in the center of the hall. Her body was mostly straight, but her head was tilted almost all the way to the side. Her eyes were fixed on the wall, and her beak was completely hung open. Mike could even see a small row of teeth inside the beak. The endoskeleton inside had its own small metal jaw. Chica was tall enough to breach cobwebs that hung down from the ceiling. As soon as she saw Mike peering from the window, she turned to face him. Mike was confused. He thought since they were talking that they were in day mode, especially after pressing the button. Yet they walked around, which he assumed was exclusively a night mode setting. The power meter was down to 2%. Suddenly a low laughter filled the left hall. Mike clicked the key to view it. Freddy's top hat was almost touching the camera. Mike hadn't seen Freddy leave the stage before, so this slightly rattled him. Freddy marched up to the office window. Mike glared at him. The animatronic's head was large. Freddy's eyebrows narrowed as his eyes focused on Mike.
Is that what I think it is?
Freddy asked in a deep voice.
You shouldn't be here, fella.
It didn't take much thought for Mike to realize that these were his voice lines when seeing a naked endoskeleton. He was somewhat in day mode and could speak, and because he still saw Mike as an endoskeleton at night, these lines played out now. 1% of the power remained. Mike stuck his middle finger out at Freddy and laid back in his chair, waiting for the power to go out so he could be locked inside the room with the door staying down. The power meter soon reached 0%, going out. The few lights in the building turned off abruptly, including the dim bulb above Mike's head. The monitor and entire computer system with it shut off as well. Slow electronic sounds rang out for a moment before all went silent. A panel in the back of the office creating a constant electric buzzing ceased to make any noise. The office fan stopped. And out of nowhere, both of the doors slid up, opening. Mike watched with wide eyes as the two doors mechanically moved upwards, slowly exposing him to the horrors outside his office. No, Mike said to himself. The doors were not supposed to open in his mind. Why would the doors open with no power? Why is the power holding them down? That's bullshit, he thought. He wanted to run away, but Freddy was on one side and Chica was on the other. His eyes were not fully adjusted to the pitch-black abyss that was now his office. Footsteps wandered closer. Out of nowhere, Freddy's inner speakers began playing a music box version of the Toreador March, the character's main theme. The metallic musical chimes and the tune of the song sounded happy. A light within the mascot suit flashed to the tune of it. The cold, glowing eyes of Freddy were fixed on Mike as the cheerful melody played loudly, making the situation that much more morbid. The glow in Freddy's eyes blinked to the music. Mike stared up at Freddy with fear, wondering how long this would continue. He waited and waited until suddenly, Freddy stopped. The song cut off abruptly and the light from inside of the animatronic turned off. Mike could no longer see him or anything else in the room. He crawled down to the ground as quietly as possible. He sat in the corner and looked up toward where Freddy was. Everything was pitch black. He heard a few footsteps slowly inching in his direction. Mike looked up and the room was somehow even darker than before. He tried to focus on the office desk. That's when he noticed his vision was only darker because Freddy was standing right in front of him, blocking his view. Mike crouched down, putting his head in his hands, trying not to move or make a sound. Just then, the relieving sound of the grandfather clock blared through the speakers. The lights all turned on at once, and Mike was horrified to see Freddy crouching down to him. Freddy's eyelids were wide open, as was his mouth. Mike instantly pushed off the ground and stood up, backing away. As Mike stumbled backwards through the right side doorway, Freddy turned his head. His eyebrows were still narrow, and his gaze remained fixed on Mike. Mike felt unsettled. Freddy leaned up and stood tall, but wouldn't take his eyes off the night guard. Mike walked away, still looking back at the creepy robotic bear. The last thing Mike saw before leaving was Freddy blinking. Dominique's eyelids rolled down over his eyes for only a split second to temporary darkness. Blink. He was running down the hall with a model airplane he had built earlier that day. Decorations of pizzas and the animatronic characters at Freddy's were littered all throughout the restaurant. Most of the pictures were in frames. There was one iconic poster of 4 Freddy Fazbear faces in multicolor flat art. Light reflected off of the picture frame, but Dominique was still amazed by it. Blink. Now he was with his parents. A nice warm cheese pizza had just been brought to his family's table. He remembered grabbing a slice and taking a large bite. It had been so long since he tasted food, yet the distinct taste of pizza was memorable. He remembered grabbing the Parmesan shaker and covering the rest of his slice with the cheesy white flakes. Blink. He then stood at an arcade game. He couldn't remember what game it was, but it seemed new. The machine was bright, as though it had just been polished. When the character he controlled in the game died, he ran to the other side of the arcade. The carpet he ran across was black, with neon shapes and colors that all popped out at him. Blink. Dominique stood in line before the Balloon Boy, an animatronic of a little boy with bright blue eyes. The Balloon Boy wore a red and blue striped propeller hat and shirt that matched. His pants were dark blue and his shoes were brown. There were 2 blue stripes per 1 red stripe, and his nose seemed to be an orange triangle, vaguely resembling that of a scarecrow. He had a pink spot on both of his cheeks, representing blush. His grin was ample. He seemed to be standing next to a machine. He would activate the machine whenever kids put in a quarter. It would then make a balloon, and the Balloon Boy would grab it and give it to said child, giggling or saying hello. Blink. Dominique was now first in line. The Balloon Boy's eyes and smile were wide. Dominique reached out to insert a quarter, but a big yellow hand swooped down and blocked it. He looked up. There, standing above him, was a golden bunny. Dominique had never seen this character before. His bow tie resembled the shiny violet curtains of Pirate's Cove. Rather than having only the bottom row of teeth like the animatronics, he had a full row on the top and bottom. His 2 front teeth were particularly pronounced, like bug teeth. The golden rabbit slowly lowered a red balloon down to him. Blink. Dominique held the Golden Rabbit mascot's hand, walking across the eatery. He turned to the side, still following. He held the balloon string in his other hand. The mascot stopped in front of 2 large red doors. He turned back to look around. The boy noticed his eyes were not as animated as Freddy and the gang. They were mostly still. He started to get suspicious. Blink. He was now in a cold, dark room. Dominique looked around and could barely see. He spotted the golden bunny next to the cracked open door. The person inside removed the mascot head completely and placed it on the ground. The boy became scared as he saw this man rip off the rest of the suit. He had long brown hair and was oddly thin. Dominique noticed that Freddy Fazbear was sitting in the corner of the room. His stomach was open as though it was a compartment. Blink. Dominique now watched everyone. He was on the big stage, the star of the show. All the children were cheering him on. He tried to move but had severe difficulty. He turned his head. Next to him on the stage was Bonnie the Bunny. Suddenly, his jaw started to move uncontrollably as music blasted through the speakers inside of him. It took a lot to fight, but he finally managed to roll his eyes down and blink. Now he was here. Mike spaced out as the forklift he operated moved forward. Industrial sounds of machines functioning in the background were phased out. He was in his own world. His eyelids felt heavy and he was tired, but not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. Mike desperately wanted to hop off the forklift and go home early. He thought about Mia, the one thing that motivated him. She was mainly what kept him going. However, the candle was starting to burn out. The stress between both jobs was getting to him, but he needed them desperately. Suddenly, he heard a loud thud. Mike was jostled back. He immediately stopped the forklift and looked down. "Hey!" someone yelled. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Mike saw an employee he didn't recognize. The employee had a hard hat and plastic goggles. He was thin and looked to be in his 50s. Mike noticed that the forklift had collided with a stack of boxes that this man and someone else were carrying. The boxes were now scattered across the floor. Mike stepped onto the side of the forklift and hopped to the ground, instantly about to start help picking them up. "Always doing this shit!" the old employee yelled, shoving him. Mike was thrusted backwards. Mike wasn't going to take this disrespect. Fights were common in the warehouse, and for many years, Mike had done his best to avoid them. After everything he'd been through that week, he was no longer able to control himself. After the little custody he had was being challenged, after Peter smashed his daughter's Game Boy, after all the worrying at night, he wasn't going to take this anymore. He finally let his rage own him. The old man started walking away as if nothing had happened. "The fuck, man?" Mike yelled back at him. The man didn't even turn around to face him, which infuriated Mike. Out of everything, this level of disrespect is what drove him. He ran up to the guy. He jumped forward, arms out, and tackled him. Both he and the other employee tumbled onto the cement floor. Other workers stopped to watch, amused by workplace brawls. As the man turned to look up, Mike punched him in the face. Mike hit him again and again until the man's nose started bleeding. Mike felt nothing but satisfaction and wicked joy, as if fighting this one guy was like fighting everything. All of his problems. "Mike, stop!" someone yelled. Everyone glanced back and began to disperse as the warehouse manager walked up to the scene. When Mike came back to reality, he saw his boss walking in on him attacking a now bleeding older man. "Asshole!" the man spat in a cowardly, defeated voice. He and Mike stood up. "What the hell's going on here?" the warehouse manager asked. "He crashed the thing again!" Mike opened his mouth to speak but found it useless. This was the third forklift incident that week, and even if he tried to explain himself, he knew he couldn't articulate anything correctly at that moment. He was too angry. Adrenaline pumped through his veins. "Mike, you're done. Go get your things and see me in my office," the warehouse manager stated firmly. Mike said nothing, turned around, and angrily departed to his car. The employees all stared at him and whispered to one another as he passed. He took off his coveralls and threw them in the back. He opened the door to his car and got inside. He turned it on and began driving out of the gravel parking lot. He tried to calm himself down, knowing he would go on to make rash decisions if he didn't. But just as he was driving away, the anger kicked in harder. He honked the horn of his car. His boss and the other employee looked at him. He stuck his hand out the window and put up only his middle finger. "Fuck this place," he told himself. The job had been grating for so long anyway. He barely made any money despite being there for over a decade. However, this left him in a great predicament. He wanted to leave Freddy's, but now it was his only source of income left. He drove past the tall pine trees and out of this area entirely while thinking of what to do next. First, he needed to calm down and rationalize everything. In the back of his mind, he knew he had gone too far with the rude worker, though he wasn't ready to admit it yet, not even to himself. It started to rain as Mike drove back to Corey's apartment. He turned on the radio, but every station in the vicinity played nothing but static, so he shut it off. By the time he parked at the apartment building, the rain had increased immensely. He stepped out and became drenched in the short time that it took to reach the door from his car. He walked up the stairs slowly and carefully until he reached Corey's apartment. He fished the key from his pocket and unlocked the door. He took off his shoes and coat as he entered. Mike went up to the telephone, not proud of what he was about to do. He still had the number to Freddy's on a sticky note on the kitchen table. He punched in the number and waited.
Hello, thank you for calling Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. My name is...
Yeah, can I speak to the manager? Mike interrupted.
Yeah, sure, one moment.
The employee put the phone down. Mike stood by for half a minute before someone picked up.
Hi, I'm Robert, the manager and CEO. What can I do for you?
Robert asked. Yeah, hey, this is Mike. I was wondering if I could get more hours somehow, like take up extra shifts if anyone is sick or something.
Yeah, actually, we don't have a night shift guy for the weekend. Do you think you could come in on Saturday for a 6th night?
Yeah, I can do that.
Great, thanks.
Robert hung up. Mike put the phone back and went to the guest bedroom he was staying in. He laid on the bed and tried to reflect. The last thing he wanted to do was spend another minute at Freddy's. But now, he had no choice. Not only did he desire more custody, but he had bills to pay with Corey. He couldn't afford to be jobless for very long. After having applied everywhere else before Freddy's, he knew it wouldn't be a good decision to quit. It took him a very long time to fall asleep, being very nervous about his future and bitter about what happened at the warehouse. However, tiredness got the better of him, and he fell into a deep slumber. Mike gazed at himself in the mirror as he clipped his tie onto his dress shirt. He had woken up 20 minutes before his alarm was supposed to go off, and he didn't want to sit in the darkness waiting for it. He decided to use that time productively and get dressed. He pulled up his black dress pants and tightened his belt. Mike walked into the living room and made a bowl of cereal. As soon as he finished eating it, he went to his car and sat in it for a minute without driving. He debated whether or not he should even go to Freddy's in the first place. Deep down, without another job, he knew refusing to go wasn't a viable option. His gas tank was almost empty, but rather than finding a 24-hour gas station, he just kept driving to Freddy's. After parking in the middle of the lot, taking 2 spots shamelessly, he reluctantly got out and marched toward the building. He took out his key and unlocked the door. Mike tiptoed quietly to his office. He was partially scared he would see an animatronic at the end of the nearby hallways. The journey from the front door to the office was luckily uneventful. He sat down in his chair and leaned back. After stretching, he leaned upright and checked the monitor. Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica were on stage. He checked Pirate's Cove. The curtains were closed. Even though everything was fine, Mike started experiencing anxiety about what he knew was to come. The scent of the musty, decaying walls mixed with the pizza subtly reminded Mike of where he was. Even the smells were tied with the fear he had about this place. When the phone rang, Mike jumped out of his seat. He could see Bonnie's head tilt upward on the camera in response to hearing the ring. The bluish-purple rabbit began walking down the stage stairs. Mike put his hand on the left door button in anticipation, knowing Bonnie would exclusively go to this hall. The phone rang a few more times. Mike glanced at the monitor to see if Freddy and Chica had heard it. Luckily, there was no indication of that. After the final ring, the phone guy's message played.
Oh, hello! Hey, wow, day 4.
The usually calm phone guy spoke quickly. Mike could tell he was nervous.
I knew you could do it. Hey, listen, I may not be around to send you a message tomorrow.
In the background of the recording, Mike heard a loud pounding sound. He recognized it as the animatronics knocking on the door. He remembered when Foxy banged on the door just 2 nights ago.
It's been a bad night here for me.
As his voice message continued, the knocking sound did as well. It became louder and more aggressive.
I'm kind of glad that I recorded my messages for you when I did. Hey, do me a favor. Maybe sometime you could check inside those suits in the back room.
Mike's eyes widened, knowing what this implied.
I'm going to try to hold out until someone checks. Maybe it won't be so bad. I always wondered what was in all those empty heads back there.
The Toreador March jingle played. The man on the phone had run out of power himself. Mike could also hear a faint groaning sound get louder.
Oh no.
Just as the man on the phone said this, a very loud, low-pitched scream interrupted him. The call hung up right after. What the fuck was that? Mike thought. He turned to face the left window and saw Bonnie coming, as predicted. He closed the left door. He then backed up and looked out the other window. Nothing. Okay, this shit has gone far enough, he continued to think. This is obviously some prank, and not a very good one either. Mike pondered how Robert hired him almost instantly. He was so happy to get the job at first, but now he understood why he got it so fast. Something that easy couldn't come without its flaws. You shouldn't be here, he remembered May telling him. What a total asshole. He remembered Peter snapping Mia's Game Boy. I should have knocked him senseless for that. Who the hell does he think he is? What a weirdo. He thought back to when Mia greeted Peter, and he wasn't capable of returning the most basic hello to a 5-year-old, as if he was that busy. Mike reflected on the first day when he was told he couldn't enter the premises without a child. Why is that even a rule? And that guy on the phone, carpets being replaced, bite of 87? What the hell's going on here? He almost wanted to laugh, but after deeply analyzing his whole experience at Freddy's, he couldn't. He released the left door as Bonnie strolled off. How can an animatronic even bite people? Don't they have plastic teeth? Stuffing people into suits? This can't be real, but... He sighed, peering through the window on the right side. Chica was standing there, head tilted. In one of her hands was a small plate with a cupcake. The cupcake's eyes were wider now, as if it was a robot too. No, I'm not taking my chances. He raced to the right side door and pressed the button. Chica tried to march in as the door closed and found that she couldn't move through it. If that is a real danger, then I don't want to test it. It's not like I can just break these things. It'd probably cost a fortune. I'd be fired for sure. He directed his attention back at the monitor and checked Pirate's Cove. Foxy's entire head was sticking out of the curtain and up at the camera. His eye patch was flipped up and both eyes were looking directly at the lens. As soon as Mike started watching him, the animatronic slowly moved back into Pirate's Cove. Mike turned to his right. Chica was now gone, so he opened the door. The robots were so active, Mike felt genuinely tired just from clicking the buttons and checking the monitor repeatedly, as if this was a workout. Most exercise I've gotten in years, he joked. Having to be attentive to everything at once felt like a chore. He was constantly peeking around while stepping back and forth between the doors in his office. But what if that last voicemail was real? What if the power really went out and... He continued. I mean, no way that's real. It's way too corny. They would have reviewed those voice messages before sending them to me, right? There's no way they wouldn't do that. It's probably something to make me scared or careful or whatever. Well, this is a dishonest way of doing things. The words in Mike's head were in an angry tone. He wanted to shout, but it would only attract the horrors he was trying to avoid. He wanted to give Robert a piece of his mind, though he couldn't. He wouldn't go through the entire week for nothing. He at least needed his paycheck. He started wondering if it was even worth it to collect at this point. Was risking death worth this amount of money? Was this even risking death in the first place? Or was it all some giant misunderstanding? A prank, perhaps, as he thought earlier. His mind ran in circles. He wondered if this was a joke, why was he caught in the middle of it all? Mike noticed Foxy creeping out of Pirate's Cove on the camera, getting faster and faster. He instinctively shut the left hall door. He looked at the show stage and was horrified to see only Freddy standing there. Freddy was staring directly into the camera. The animatronic's eyes were too dark to see. Only small white lights were visible in his sockets. As Mike checked the cameras, he couldn't help but keep staring back at Freddy. The robot's gaze was like a laser beam. He couldn't look away. Foxy knocking on the door scared Mike, and he jolted back in response, throwing his hands out in front of him. He turned around to make sure no one was in the right side hall either. Sure enough, it was empty. Foxy continued to pound on the left door loudly. Mike was terrified an animatronic would hear it and come closer to the sound. He watched through the left window as Foxy dashed back to Pirate's Cove. Mike then opened the left door. He considered last night and how the doors somehow opened when the power was out. He knew it should have worked the opposite way. Surely it would cost less electric charge just to keep them in their current state, rather than raising them up when the power was out, right? Mike was familiar with technology and knew this was ridiculous. He desperately wanted to talk to one of the employees about it, but didn't know who to trust. The ideal source of information on the office would be Peter, though Mike found him to be odd, and not in a good way. He pictured the strange man's naturally wide eyes, his big dark beard, and his unkempt hair. Mike looked through both windows several times to make sure none of the animatronics were near. It was hard to focus on both things at once, the oddities of Freddy's and the mascots actively wandering near him. However, doing both things at once ate up time. It was already 5 a.m. Mike had to go to the bathroom, although what happened on the first night made him paranoid about doing so. He recalled Bonnie wandering in as he tried to do his business. Though Mike couldn't hold it, he felt the urine aching against his bladder as the urge to go was strong, and trying to suppress it only caused more pain. He looked at the cameras for any other bathroom nearby, but there seemed to be only the 3 of them, all in the middle hall from the lobby. He clicked the F key to view the camera facing the area. None of the animatronics were there. He looked at a few other rooms, leading from the office to the bathrooms. Freddy was still staring at the camera on the stage, his head now tilted slightly. Foxy was peeking out of Pirate's Cove. Bonnie was walking down the left hallway. No one was actually close to his office. He closed the left door and waited for Bonnie to go away. He peeked through the cameras and found Chica in the arcade next to a table. As soon as Mike clicked the F key, the screen brightened slightly, and Mike could see Chica turn around and gaze into the lens. He was scared, but he knew this was his only shot. Freddy barely left the stage, Bonnie was just walking back to it, and Chica was distracted looking at the camera. Mike peered into the right hall. No one was in sight. He bolted straight for the corridor leading to the lobby. He immediately turned left into the middle hall where the bathrooms were and opened the door to the disability one. He quietly stepped inside and closed the door. The bathroom light automatically turned on. Mike remembered the first agonizing flash from the automatic light. He was prepared for it this time and covered his eyes, squinting and peeking through the cracks between his fingers. It didn't take long for his eyes to adjust. He looked around and realized it would be possible to stay in this bathroom for the entire rest of the night. However, if he was caught doing this rather than watching the restaurant, he'd be fired. After urinating, the toilet automatically flushed. The sudden loud noise perturbed him, and he knew it would attract unwanted attention. He sat in the corner of the room and waited. After what felt like half an hour, Mike got up and put his ear up to the bathroom door. He didn't hear any animatronics nearby, so he slowly opened it. He looked to the lobby. No one. He looked at the playroom. Foxy was standing at the end of the hall. His head twitched a few times, and the metal inside squeaked out. Mike eyed him only for a second before bolting to the lobby. Foxy chased him. He could hear the robot's metal feet hitting the floor quickly as he sprinted. Mike turned right and looked back. Foxy had run so fast he had crashed into the entrance door. He scrambled to get back into a standing position. Mike practically dove into his office. He watched with worry as Foxy rushed at him. Mike quickly hit the button to shut the right door and backed up into the left hallway. Foxy crashed into the door, causing a loud thud. Beyond horrified, Mike turned his head and saw Bonnie was running down the left hall. He jumped into his office and hit the left door button to close it. Foxy's loud knocking on the right door grew heavier and heavier as Bonnie glared at Mike through the left side window. Mike only had 10% of the power left, but it was 5:50. He was so close to 6 a.m. He navigated the cameras carefully to look for the other characters. Freddy was no longer on the stage. Mike was very uneasy whenever Freddy was roaming, since the main mascot didn't leave the stage much. He looked through the rooms and couldn't find Freddy anywhere until he stared closely at the camera facing the bathrooms. He could see a dark figure peeking out from the women's restroom entrance. 2 small lights coming from the head of the silhouette were very obviously from Freddy's eyes. The shape of its top hat was unmistakable. Mike looked at the time. 5:59. As the minute passed with both doors closed, the animatronics slowly started returning to the show stage until the grandfather clock played its tune. 6 a.m. struck just in time. Mike opened both doors and was taken aback to see Foxy still standing at the right side doorway. Instead of maneuvering around the Pirate Fox mascot, Mike walked through the left hall to the show stage, through the playroom, to the lobby, and out the door. It was a less convenient way out, but worth it to avoid the freakishly quick and aggressive animatronic.
Arr, I be Foxy the Pirates. The fiercest pirates in all the 7 seas.
The animatronic said in a pirate dialect. Children surrounded the small stage in the corner of the room. The shiny purple curtains were open, and Foxy was giving an introductory monologue.
Come with me, young ones. Join me on my adventure.
Terence remembered having to push past other kids to even see him. When he finally made it to the front of the row, he could better see what was going on.
My matey here has the cards. Go out and get all the stamps, and ye shall get me treasure.
Okay, line up single file, said an employee standing by the curtain. She sounded like she didn't want to be there. Her monotone voice was funny in contrast to how excited Foxy's tone was. Terence stood in line and waited patiently for his card. He knew everyone else would be figuring them out top to bottom. In an effort to be the first one to finish, he decided to start with the last riddle first. Yellow, round, eats up dots, corner of Foxy's favorite spot. It didn't take Terence very long to remember the last time he was here, and Foxy was talking about visiting Arcade Island several times per week, spending his treasure to play games. Terence already knew the riddle referred to the Pac-Man arcade game. He instantly ran 2 rooms over and found the Pac-Man arcade machine in the corner. Terence looked at the screen and at the deck below with the buttons. Nothing. He turned to check behind the machine and found a stamp hanging by a small chain pinned to it. He grabbed the stamp and firmly pressed it inside the box next to the riddle at the bottom. "Hey, kid," someone called. Terence glanced to the side and saw a yellow bunny character, somewhat similar to Bonnie, standing between 2 big open doors. He could tell this was a person in a mascot suit and not an animatronic, only because the person moved too fluidly. The costume's mouth movements lined up exactly with what the person was saying rather than creaking around like an animatronic. His voice was muffled and carried no static. The golden rabbit was leaning half of its body out from the room behind the crimson doors. Hey, Terence said awkwardly. Who are you, some version of Bonnie? Haven't you heard? The mascot uttered. The person seemed to be putting on a deep voice with a slight accent as though he was playing a character. I'm Spring Bonnie. I was here before Bonnie, actually. Spring Bonnie? Terence asked, chuckling a bit. That's dumb. What, did Bonnie get the Midas touch or something? Oh, whatever, just listen. The man hushed, breaking character for only a moment. I see you're doing Foxy's scavenger hunt, huh? Terence nodded. Well, I actually have all the treasures he gives out right here in this room. The mascot pointed at the dark room he was peeking out of. I'm not supposed to talk to strangers. What's your name, kid? Terence. Terence. It's nice to meet you. And you know that I'm Spring Bonnie, so we're not strangers anymore, right? Well, I guess not, the boy said nervously. The mascot reached into the room and pulled out a handful of the chocolate gold coins Foxy would usually distribute after scavenger hunts. Now come on, the mascot grumbled in a normal voice. I'm only supposed to do this with 1 kid per day. Do you want it or not? The mascot appealed to Terence, realizing the boy was a tiny bit older than most of the kids there. He acted as though this was some company policy, that there was to be 1 randomly selected scavenger hunter per day to give extra treasures to. Fine, Terence answered, following the golden rabbit-dressed man into the room. A dingy light barely illuminated it, enough for the boy to see the shelves along the walls. There were 3 arcade machines in the corner that seemed to be deactivated. He turned to the person in the Spring Bonnie suit. The man inside was taking it off piece by piece. First he removed the head, next he grabbed his hand and pulled his arm out of the inside sleeve. He maneuvered himself out of the rest of the suit until the one piece, torso and legs, were sitting on the ground next to the head. Terence watched with concern as the man started giggling a bit. He was tall and very thin. His brown hair was long and somewhat frizzy. He wore a fitted lavender-colored button-up dress shirt and black jeans. He turned around. Terence saw him for only a second as the man pulled a long kitchen knife from his pocket. Terence found his crazed expression to be terrifying, but before he could say anything, the man reached for the light switch on the wall and flipped it down. On the way back to the apartments, Mike realized his car was still running low on gas. He pulled into a nearby gas station and parked at a pump. He meandered inside. There was a subtle chime from the bells just above the door. No one else was in the vicinity, other than the cashier. Mike found himself wandering to the back where the drinks were sold. He eyed the alcohol, wanting it more than ever. He opened the door to grab a case of beer, but closed it. Nah, he told himself. Instead, he picked up a can of Coca-Cola. He brought it up to the cash register, paying with a $20 bill. You can put the rest on pump 2, he instructed. The clerk punched the information into the machine and handed him his receipt. Mike grabbed the soda and made his way outside. There was a slight breeze in the air, along with the sound of a paper blowing around in the wind. A piece of paper was poorly staped to a lamppost and made an annoying crumpling noise as the wind ran through it, almost blowing it away. Mike pressed the page down onto the post to read it. It was a missing poster for someone named Ryan Ramey. Last seen, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Mike looked at it in horror, but for some reason wasn't all too shocked. He knew there was something deeper going on at Freddy's, and it became more apparent to him that this wasn't just a prank after all. Whatever went on was very real, And as much as he wanted nothing to do with it, he knew he needed it, at least until he got his paycheck. He knew there was only one more night to go before he'd get paid, and then an additional night if he desperately needed extra cash. It was risking his life to work at this grisly arcade, but it couldn't all be for nothing. One more night, he thought. Oscar listened to Freddy and the band sing loud rock songs as he drew a picture. The room contained only a handful of children who seemed to be playing tag. Despite the obnoxious activity going on around him, Oscar was able to draw his favorite mascot in peace. He started with Freddy's head. First, he drew the outline with a black crayon. He noticed the sides of Freddy's head had dimple-like bumps that stuck out where his jaw was. He then filled in the inside of Freddy's ears and the top of his jaw with a tan color. He would have rather used a slightly brighter shade of brown, but didn't have any other color of crayon that would work. Oscar ignored the metallic parts where metal obviously connected together and decided to draw Freddy as though he was a real creature and not a robot, though he still decided to make the outline of Freddy's eyes very dark and bold, finding it a defining feature. He used a bright shade of blue to fill in the iris. He then proceeded to finish the rest of the body. He looked at Freddy, who was singing. In one hand he held the microphone close to his mouth. His other arm was up in the air, slightly bent. Oscar decided this would be the pose he referenced. As he grazed the crayon along the paper, he felt the world outside of his drawing start to become silent. His focus and attention was fully on his art now, as if he escaped reality in just that moment. It felt slightly euphoric and calming. The smells and sounds became dull until finally, he finished the piece. He stared down at it. The picture was perfect. His drawing was more lifelike than the animatronic itself. He glanced around at the other kids who were running back and forth along the tables. He carefully picked up the piece of paper and crept to the show stage. The animatronics were concluding their song. When Oscar finally got to the stage, he held it up. "Freddy, look!" Oscar said excitedly. "I made this for you!" Freddy's head tilted downward and focused on the boy, breaking from routine, though as he did, something leaked from the animatronic. When Freddy looked down, a small liquid drop rolled from his eye and splashed the corner of the page. Oscar closely analyzed it. The liquid was dark red. Freddy turned his head back up and continued talking amongst the animatronics. Oscar would have been normally frustrated at his artwork being tainted, but he was more distraught at the thought of the robotic mascot bleeding. He found an employee walking by. Excuse me," he asked. Robert looked at the boy. I showed Freddy my drawing, and I think he's bleeding on my paper." He set the page on the table and pointed at the splotch of red in the corner, which had now slightly expanded. "This came out of Freddy's eye. It was definitely blood. There was no mistake." Thank you for letting me know," Robert replied. "Why don't you go run over to the playroom for a bit? We'll patch him up." And with that, Oscar took off, leaving his drawing behind.
The show will be back in 5 minutes,
Bonnie announced. The animatronic's eyelids shut and they all looked downward as the curtains swooped into place. Conveniently for Robert, all the kids left the room when the show stopped. Robert saw an employee cleaning tables. "Allie, I need you to get Freddy to the parts and service room really quick," he commanded. Allie nodded, knowing the exact procedure. She grabbed a dolly-like device and put it up to Freddy Fazbear. She strapped him to it before grabbing it and pulling it down. It made a loud thud as it fell onto its 4 wheels. Freddy was lying still. She pushed the wheeled platform forward down 2 thin ramps on both sides of the stairs. Robert watched her as she angled it to fit into the parts and service room. "Thanks," Robert said. "I'll take it from here." She walked back out to the tables. Robert propped Freddy upward, the platform now against the wall. There was a visible handprint on Freddy's eye where the fabric was caving in. "What's wrong?" Peter asked from the doorway behind him. Robert turned to face him but said nothing. He glanced back around and put his hands into Freddy's eyes. Sure enough, a small drop of blood was on his finger. Robert clicked 2 metal beams on the back of Freddy's neck and pulled the mascot head off. Robert and Peter immediately spotted the top of someone's head inside the suit. Robert opened Freddy's chest cavity and found the dead body cramped inside. Blood oozed onto the ground, but most of it was dry and dark, as though it had been stained there for weeks. Robert was barely able to recognize the man as one of the past night guards. "Isn't that the guy who left phone recordings?" he asked, anxiety present in his voice. "Oh, shit," His voice was shaky. He felt guilty about not even knowing the man's name. Peter shut the door and walked up to the open mascot suit. He gazed at the man's body. He had clearly been stuffed in forcefully, and therefore all the gears and metallic pieces had crushed him. His skin was torn in several places. Robert put his hand over his mouth and tried not to gag and cry out. The foul smell was released into the room only then. Peter took a close look, clearly not unsettled. "I guess old habits die hard," he said. "We need to call someone," Robert yelled quickly, hyperventilating. Who do we call? I'll dial 911 right now. And what?" Peter asked in a slightly angry voice. "Go to jail? Get the place shut down for good? Never see your wife or kids again because one of your robots did this?" Robert gave him a disgusted and horrified look. He was disturbed by how nonchalant Peter was acting, as if he felt nothing at all. "How can you even say that?" "Yeah, the guy's dead. You want to call the cops? Then what? You go down too?" "No, we have people to pay who rely on this job. You have a family to take care of, and we have a business to run." "Peter!" Robert started. Through all the emotions, he couldn't come up with any rebuttal. Peter was right. Robert had everything to lose from reporting it. The idea of ignoring it sounded morally insane, but he wouldn't want this to hurt him and his loved ones. He knew his wife might leave him over it, and his family would be associated with the tragedy. He would lose custody of his kids, go to jail, and perhaps never see the light of day again. He could see it all now, vividly. "Now here's what we're gonna do," Peter established matter-of-factly. "I'm gonna take old Freddy home with me right now, clean him off. It'll be like this never happened. Cancel the shows until I'm done. I can have him clean by 7. We don't tell his family, we don't tell anyone. Got it?" No, we can't just..." Robert put his head in his hands. He let out a muffled scream of agony. "Fuck me!" There was way too much to lose. He was completely perplexed and wasn't sure what to do. He looked back at Peter, who whistled while closing the animatronic gently. Robert eyed him, finding it bizarre how calm he acted about it. But against his better judgment, Robert decided to let it be forgotten. "Do what you have to do," he said quickly. He promptly left the parts and service room. On his way out, he pressed the large button on the wall to prevent the animatronics from continuing their performances for the day. Mike woke up in a cold sweat. He couldn't remember his dream, but he knew it was something bad. He sat up and breathed deeply. He groggily went into the living room and sat down on the couch. Corey studied him from the kitchen. "I saw the missing poster you were talking about at Circle K," Corey said, bringing Mike a cup of coffee. He had previously made the coffee for himself, but knew Mike needed it more. "Did you know him?" "Nah, his name was Ryan something. I don't know the guy," Mike explained. "I wonder if he was the one in the phone messages. He probably died and got gored alive by one of the mascot suits." Corey set the coffee mug onto the table in front of the couch. Mike grabbed it and instantly started sipping it. He burned his lips on the first sip and set it back down. "And I know your sleep schedule is all weird now. Are you getting enough sleep? I mean, it all sounds kind of sketchy, but maybe you got it all wrong, you know?" "No, something weird is happening there. I just know it, but I don't know what it is. I'm telling you, all the employees act weird. They all stare at me. They act all..." Mike tried collecting his thoughts. "I don't know how to explain it. The place is just creepy. Apparently it was around in the 80s. I think it closed 10 years ago. I can imagine why." Corey shrugged. "Well, I just can't imagine it's dangerous. Can't you just bust them up if things go bad? I mean, they'd probably break easily." Mike shook his head. "They'd fire me. It's best to just lay low. Besides, it's my last night. I'll be able to get your money for letting me stay here. I can buy some groceries, and maybe I can find a full-time job that actually pays some bills." Corey sat down. "Okay, but I'm telling you, as your friend, that if this is really something that bad, the money ain't worth losing your head over." Mike stared at the ground and didn't say anything. He knew inside that his own morals wouldn't let him go very long without paying partial rent to Corey. He hated the idea of riding off the backs of others for free. In his eyes, it was more deadbeat behavior that he wanted to evolve from, mooching off of others. "And didn't you say you were working a 6th night this week?" "To hell with that," Mike chuckled. "After I get my paycheck, I'm out of there." He stood up and walked to the freezer. He put several ice cubes into his coffee, which almost instantly cooled it down. He looked at the time. It was 11:40. He continued to try and drink the caffeinated brown sludge as quickly as he could. As soon as he was done, he placed his cup in the sink and strolled to the door. Mike walked out to his car and drove down the same familiar roads to get to Freddy's. He felt the dread sweep over him, taking the form of stomach pain. He couldn't tell if it was really anxiety or just the coffee. Either way, he felt physical aching. He turned into the same parking lot and gazed at the same glowing sign with all the cartoon mascots. Mike knew there was so much more behind their bright colors and smiles. He stepped out of his car and immediately felt the cold breeze run through his clothes. The temperature was only dropping throughout the month of November. Just then, a pickup truck full of teenagers passed by. They were all laughing, clearly drunk out of their minds. As the truck drove past Freddy's, the teenagers all spotted Mike walking to the entrance. Guys?" one of them yelled out. "Is that Freddy Fazbear?" The others cracked up laughing, and Mike smiled. "Ho, ho, 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 ho." They stupidly sang to the tune of the Toreador March, knowing it was Freddy Fazbear's theme song. Mike remembered doing things like this on Friday nights just over 2 decades prior. Now his Friday nights would be spent being bothered by creepy robots. He wondered where the times had gone as he unlocked the door and tiptoed into the building. It was not much warmer than the outside. Mike did his usual scanning of the premises to avoid the animatronics. He could vaguely see a shadow at the end of the center hall, the one leading to the playroom. A tall, dark figure stood there, staring at Mike. Upon squinting, he saw the outline of what looked like Freddy. The dark silhouette tilted its head, lights in its eyes turned on, and Mike could see the 2 white dots. Without any hesitation, Mike sprinted to his office. He moved the computer mouse quickly and the monitor woke up, turning on instantly. The first camera that popped up was of the show stage. The main band was all standing still, which made Mike wonder what he had just seen. If Freddy was on stage, then who was in the hall? His heart skipped a beat when he checked the Pirate's Cove camera. Foxy was already poking his snout between the curtains. Mike turned to the camera, aiming at where he saw the silhouette. Nothing. Then again, the cameras were too dark to see much. The hefty robotic brown bear surely couldn't have moved back to the stage that fast. Mike frantically clicked through all the F keys. He was as sure as the sun would rise tomorrow that he had just witnessed one of the animatronic characters in the hallway. He glanced around the arcade. Nothing. He checked the other camera in the show stage room, facing the rows of tables. Nothing. He clicked on the parts and service room. Bonnie's face was pressed up against the camera. His eyes were too dark to be seen. Only the small beams of light within were visible. Mike jumped back in fear, frightened. Bonnie's mouth was open slightly, and the lights in his eyes were fixed on the camera as though they were pupils. This sent cold chills down Mike's spine. Why was the robot looking directly into the camera? What was he looking at? The realization struck Mike in the face that Bonnie was looking at him. Why was he doing this? Was he programmed to? Did he know he was being watched? If so, why was he programmed to stare? This transpired into a row of anxious thoughts. Mike hadn't even stopped to think about how Foxy knew he was being looked at. How did any of them know? He had many questions but couldn't form coherent thoughts in the moment of terror. Out of nowhere, the phone rang loudly. Mike nearly hopped out of his skin when he heard it. He thought the man on the phone had supposedly died. The ringing brought him relief, as if he was going to hear about how the last message was just some joke, or how the guy escaped the animatronics. It rang 2 more times as Mike collected himself. On the 3rd time, the voice message played out. The second the line picked up, there was loud static. Mike backed up from the phone and squeezed his temples. The static played for only a few seconds before an extremely deep voice began speaking gibberish. The voice was so unnaturally deep that none of the words were even audible. Mike stared at the phone with wide eyes, backing up from it slowly. The exact tones and inflections of whatever was being said were off, as though someone was speaking in reverse. After several seconds of this deep gargling, a loud sound boomed through the phone's speaker. Mike had no idea what it was until it played again only a few seconds later. It sounded like a low scream. The second long scream played out a 3rd time as the extremely low-sounding voices continued mumbling. After another short moment, there was a high-pitched scream. It cut out with small split-second moments of silence between, and just like that, the phone hung up. Mike stood at the end of the room, just in front of the yellow lockers along the back wall of the office. He didn't know what to do. He slowly crept back over to the desk and sat down in his chair. What the fuck was that? He thought. The voices sounded demonic. He tried to discern if it was a joke or if this was somehow real. But what could have made those weird noises? Mike looked around the cameras worriedly. Chica was gone from the stage. He hoped this was all some misunderstanding, like Corey said. However, nobody was transparent with him. He wanted to move on, but all he could think about was the demonic-sounding voice through the phone. It sent shivers through his body. As he noticed both Bonnie and Foxy marching to the office, he quickly shut the left door. He kept watch of the right doorway to make sure Chica didn't sneak up on him. Foxy knocked on the closed door a few times before getting confused and walking away, but Bonnie stayed and peered at Mike through the glass. His mouth opened randomly and he tilted downward, leaning on the window. His eyelids had receded all the way into the back of his head, making his eyes look wide and scary. He stayed for minutes as Mike continued checking the restaurant on the camera system. He looked at the Pirate's Cove camera and saw Foxy already wandering out of Pirate's Cove again, but when Mike clicked that camera's key, Foxy turned his head to the camera and quickly leaned back. Mike checked the show stage. Freddy was gone. He sat his head on the table and sighed, getting stressed. He wished the animatronics could just turn off at night. Either that or the technicians could reprogram them to behave normally. The technology was advanced enough to detect endoskeletons and put them into mascot costumes, but not advanced enough to differentiate humans from endoskeletons. How convenient, Mike said. He noticed that Bonnie was gone and opened the left door. He heard someone slowly walking down the corridor leading from the lobby to the right hallway. Immediately knowing it was Chica, Mike closed the right side door and waited. He glanced at the monitor and noticed something strange. One of the posters on the wall was different. The poster was originally of Freddy Fazbear standing in front of a dark brick wall with the word "Celebrate" at the top. Mike had seen it a few times upon checking all the rooms, but the picture had somehow changed shape. Now Freddy's hand was toward his head, as if he was trying to pull off his own face. The top half of his face was leaning down. Mike stared at it for several minutes, wondering if they had changed the poster without him noticing. Rather than chalking it up to sleep deprivation or simply seeing things, he knew full well this was there. He blinked several times and the poster didn't change. They must have put this one up, he thought, but why? It looks like Freddy's taking off his own face. Eventually, when he realized Chica was marching back to the stage, he opened the right door. Mike viewed the Pirate's Cove camera and saw Foxy looking directly at it. The animatronics hook was pulling back half of the curtain, and his jaw was wide open, full of sharp teeth. That's when Mike remembered what the phone guy said about the bite of 87, and how the animatronics stayed on stage because one of them bit a guest. Given how sharp Foxy's teeth looked, combined with the fact that he was out of order, Mike guessed he was the character responsible. He flipped back to the left hallway camera. The large Freddy poster in the hall was somehow back to normal. He rubbed his eyes before looking at it again. He had just watched it change. He knew full well what he saw. When he realized the end of that hallway was right outside his office, he stood up and stepped out the left doorway. The poster was larger than he had expected, but it was still completely normal. He watched it, observing around the area. Just then, a loud, low-pitched laugh echoed. Mike turned around and saw Freddy Fazbear walking toward him. Freddy's eyes were dark and the white dots of light glared at Mike like a predator about to hunt its prey. Freddy's jaw opened and the robotic mascot laughed again. Mike leapt back into his office and slammed the left door button. Freddy pressed himself against the glass as he continued to laugh. Mike backed up and bumped into the desk, knocking over the empty soda cup, which was still there. It fell onto the floor and rolled around. In the corner of his eye, he spotted something strange through the right doorway. He stood up and placed the cup on the desk before stepping into the hall. The children's drawings on the wall had all been replaced with new art. All of the pictures were the exact same. They were all black pieces of construction paper with a tan circle in the middle. There were 2 black eyes with white pieces. One black oval at the bottom formed a mouth. Blue pieces streamed down from the eyes. All represent a face crying. Every single drawing was replaced with one of these. Mike found himself stepping closer to the crying child art. Something about them felt off. As he stared, the lights in that hallway flickered. He jumped and turned his head in all directions. No one else was there. The posters were all the exact same. Every single piece of construction paper was cut identically. Footsteps became apparent as Mike saw Chica walking from the lobby to him. He quickly got into his office and shut the right door. He turned on the left door light for a quick moment and saw that Freddy was gone, so he opened that door. Chica was somehow already gone too by the time he turned around. The animatronics were all particularly fast. Perhaps the shadow in the hall was Freddy after all. Mike wiggled the mouse to wake up the monitor. He looked through all the cameras. When he got to the show stage, he saw something scary. All 3 animatronics on the stage were staring at the camera. He felt their gaze pierce him. Their creepy eyes were not moving or blinking. They all stood still like statues. Their eyelids were narrowed and they looked mad. They acted aggressive, almost human. Mike clicked Pirate's Cove to see Foxy wandering out of the curtains, but he turned to look at the camera as soon as Mike clicked it and retreated. The fact that the animatronic seemed to know when they were being watched creeped out Mike. He opened the right side door and peeked at the camera in that hallway. There was a small red light on it. He clicked the key to view that area on the monitor. Sure enough, that light turned green, and before he could ponder it for any longer, the grandfather clock chime played loudly. The lights all turned on. Mike breathed a sigh of relief. He turned and detected Freddy peeking from behind a wall, though this couldn't be Freddy, because he could see the brown bear on the stage on the monitor. Mike figured it was that silhouette from earlier. He slowly ambled to the end of the hall and turned to find nothing. He walked around the restaurant for a minute to look around. There was no sign of this alternative Freddy. Mike turned back and headed to the lobby, bumping into Peter on the way. Peter stopped him and handed him a check. "Here," he grunted. Mike accepted it and looked down to read it. The pink-colored piece of paper was addressed to Mike Schmidt for $120.50. He let out another sigh of relief. "You come back tomorrow, you can make 25 more, Peter added. Mike nodded and walked out with a grin. Finally, all the fear was going to come to an end. After 5 awful nights, he was finally rewarded, and it felt better than he expected. As he happily strolled out of the establishment, Peter sat down in the office chair. He looked through the different rooms instinctively, checking them for only a split second each. In the fraction of a second that he viewed the left hallway, he thought he could see Freddy sitting down. But when he immediately checked back, there was nothing. The sky outside was dark, while the inside of Freddy's remained bright. The business was particularly busy for a Saturday night. Aaron remembered every detail from back then. He sat at the end of a long table with several of his friends around it. They all wore cone-shaped party hats. The Freddy's employee was lighting the 10 candles on his cake as everyone watched with excitement. The employees divided the big yellow cake with bright pink frosting amongst the children. Aaron got the biggest slice first, being the birthday boy. Everyone shouted happy birthday to him, and he smiled warmly, thanking them all as he dug into his cake. When he and the children were done eating, they all scattered like roaches to play, but while most of them went to the arcade machines, Aaron wanted to crawl into the big plastic play structure, so he ran to the big playroom. Children and toddlers were rushing in and out of it, going up the ladders and then down the slides. He noticed one kid get yelled at for trying to climb up a slide as a toddler was trying to go down. Every single sound and inflection in their voices were vivid in his memories. Aaron rushed to the bottom entrance, a small plastic net surrounding platforms he had to crawl under and then on top of. He found his way onto the first triangular platform, turned around, and slid up onto the next. He did this several more times, passing the entrance to the middle set of tunnels with the small slides. He wanted to go into the upper set with the longer, faster slides. Once he reached the top, he rushed through a big turquoise plastic tube on his hands and knees. Other kids were rapidly crawling around, and he had to stop and wait for some to pass before he could go. As he came to an intersection of 4 different colored tunnels, he looked to the left and noticed a boy sitting in a netted cage-like end. "Hey!" Aaron said, crawling over to the boy. The boy turned around. His eyes were wide and he looked worried. His brown hair was a mess. One part was drooping just between his eyes. His shirt was black with 2 big gray stripes. He was holding a small plush of a golden version of Freddy. The plush had a purple top hat and bow tie with 2 big black buttons on its chest. Its eyes were black and dull. Hello," the boy said nervously. Aaron sat next to him. The two could see the whole playroom from where they were. They looked around. Kids were all crashing into the ball pit from the slides as parents watched from the corners. A small group of kids were rushing to see the animatronic performance, hearing the music and realizing it was starting up again after a long break. "Why are you all by yourself?" Aaron asked. "My brother," the boy said firmly. "My brother's always so mean to me, and I don't want to be around him right now." "Well, it's my birthday today, and we have some cake if you want some." "No thanks," the kid looked at him. "But happy birthday. My birthday's in a few days." "Oh, nice." The two sat there in awkward silence as they watched a golden rabbit animatronic mascot enter the room. He was walking away, holding a child's hand. The child held a red balloon in his other hand as he followed the dance-walking mascot. Aaron stared at this character he had never seen before. "Golden Bonnie?" he said to himself. He analyzed all of the character's features. Its movements were clearly like that of a human rather than a robot. Its shiny green eyes didn't blink at all. Its head was more round than Bonnie's, as was its jaw. Its jaw, rather than being like that of a snout, was shaped like a half circle arching above the mouth. Its teeth were slightly brownish. Beneath its shiny purple bow tie were 2 buttons like the golden Freddy doll on the boy's hand. Spring Bonnie, actually, the kid corrected. This is the 4th time I saw him walk some kid to the cafe area this week. It's weird, isn't it? I don't know. What if he's just giving out prizes or something? Aaron asked curiously. The striped shirt boy leaned forward, hugging his plush tightly. Fredbear says not to trust him, the kid warned. I heard that some kids went missing here recently, and I think it has to do with Spring Bonnie. Kids went missing? Aaron asked. Yup, the boy answered. I heard my dad talking about it. That's also why I'm staying up here. I don't want to go missing either. Just then, a deep voice blared out through the speakers in the building.
All right, it's closing time. Parents, please pick up your kids. Tomorrow is another day. Thank you for joining the party at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza.
The voice sounded like Freddy's, but deeper. Aaron had never heard it, since he had never been at Freddy's this late. I have to go. The striped shirt boy got up and began crawling out of the play structure before Aaron could even ask for his name. He watched from above as the kid walked out of the playroom. Parents left with their children, and in a matter of minutes the entire place was empty.
Thank you and good night,
Bonnie yelled, wrapping up the band's performance. The animatronic's voice could be heard from where Aaron was sitting, still in the netted cage. Too scared to go down, he remained in place and watched everyone else leave. He figured the employees would eventually spot him since the cage was visible, so he crawled back into the tunnel and sat in the intersection. Minutes passed before he heard a snapping-like sound. The lights all turned off, room by room, and when the playroom lights shut off, he froze up, eyes wide. The whole building was dark. Hello? He called out, but no one was there. He knew he couldn't stay here all night. In the silence, his movements were particularly loud. Each time he placed his hand or foot down onto the plastic, a thump could be heard. He tried to slowly and carefully creep down the slide. Remembering what the striped shirt boy told him about kids going missing filled his head with fear. Instead of crashing into the ball pit, he stood up at the end of the slide and marched through the plastic balls slowly. He stepped out onto the tile floor and looked around, his eyes still adjusting to the darkness. He tiptoed into the arcade. Most of the machines were still on. The mostly blue glowing of the screens brightened the whole room. He had been going to Freddy's regularly since it opened, and in all the many times he had been there, he had never seen it this empty and void of spirit. At first he was having trouble moving. The scene was eerie and fear paralyzed him. But as he walked around without anything happening, he felt safer. It felt like he had the whole place to himself. Despite being dark, the pizzeria was still very colorful. When his vision grew into the darkness, he started to see the little squiggly lines and shapes painted all over the blue walls. The scene went from creepy to peaceful as he calmed down. He passed tables in the cafe area. Children's drawings were still scattered all over. Most of them were of the animatronics, though plenty of others were of characters from the arcade games, like Donkey Kong. Eventually, Aaron passed his own birthday table. His slice of cake was still sitting upright on the plate. Aaron started trudging back into the playroom, debating on whether or not he should continue sliding down the slides. He remembered his parents telling him to come home when the party was over, so he figured he could stay behind just a little longer and tell them that the party continued into the night outside of Freddy's. He knew they wouldn't mind. He stood in the doorway between the playroom and the cafe and arcade, wondering what to do. He had forgotten about everything the striped shirt boy told him, until he heard a door open behind him. He spun around and saw one of the 2 big red doors open. Out stepped the Spring Bonnie mascot. Its eyes were locked onto the boy, somehow glowing now. The person inside let out a jolly laugh before waving the kid into the room. Instead of following him, Aaron ran. He wanted to run down the middle hallway from the playroom to the lobby, but Freddy stood there, letting out a low chuckle. Aaron's stomach dropped. He knew his way around the building and decided to race to the show stage room. The purple curtains of Pirate's Cove stuck out to him, so he jumped in between them and sat in the corner. His heart was racing and his breathing was rapid. He was suddenly aware of the footsteps and humming around the building, and his anxiety reached its peak when the sounds were just outside of Pirate's Cove. Aaron waited patiently, and luckily, Spring Bonnie marched away. He breathed a sigh of relief as he heard the voice call out,
Where are you?
In a playful tone. He peeked his head out and the golden rabbit was gone. But as soon as he looked back, he saw Foxy staring at him intensely. The sensors in his eyes were glowing, but the rest of his eyes were too dark to see. The 2 white dots of light grew as Foxy approached. His mouth was opening. Aaron had little time to act. He rushed out of Pirate's Cove. Bonnie had walked off the stage and was now standing in the center of the room, just between the tables. Aaron could hear Spring Bonnie's footsteps in the playroom, so he carefully tiptoed into the hallway leading to the office. The sound of metallic whirring caught his attention. The noises came from Chica, slowly moving her head to face him. She started walking at him. Her mouth was hung open. Aaron, scared out of his mind, rushed down the series of halls leading to the lobby. All he wanted to do was escape. However, the Spring Bonnie mascot spotted him from the lobby.
Come out, wherever you are.
The person inside chanted. Aaron ran back through the halls around the office. He made his way past Chica and into the show stage room. Bonnie was still standing between the rows of tables, eyeing him creepily. As Aaron dashed to the playroom, he saw Foxy guarding the tunnels. The animatronic turned around and began walking toward him. Foxy's pace picked up the more he moved until he was running. Before he could gain much speed, Aaron ran faster. In the heat of the moment, he turned into the room with the big open red doors. He shut them as quietly as he could and looked around for a place to hide. The walls were aligned with lockers, and small benches sat just in front of them. The shelves were full of random papers and animatronic parts. There were 3 deactivated arcade machines. In front of them was an empty mascot suit from an animatronic Aaron had never seen before. It looked exactly like Freddy, but was bright yellow. It had no visible endoskeleton and therefore no eyes. Aaron knew the animatronics were all very tall and big, but being this close to one made it look like a giant. He noticed that the stomach compartment was open. He crawled inside. The inside of the suit was surprisingly spacious. Aaron laid down in it for minutes, starting to relax. But then the door creaked open. He moved his head up to peek through the mascot's eye holes. He could see the silhouette of Spring Bonnie enter the room. Aaron was breathing rapidly. The creepy man in the Spring Bonnie costume laughed wickedly as he scanned around. Aaron shut his eyes and tried to calm down. And when he opened them, he noticed his vision was blocked by something. He tried to focus on what was blocking his sight and found that it was 2 white bulbs with light reflecting off of them. 2 human eyes staring into the mask. Aaron screamed, realizing the man had taken off the Spring Bonnie mascot head and was peering into the golden Freddy suit. The man's smile was maniacal. He reached around to the mascot's neck and snapped together the 2 metal bars. Aaron still shuddered at the feeling when he thought about it. It all felt like a bad dream, yet it was one of the only memories he had left. Mike rolled around in bed for hours. Without another job, he had extra free time. He wanted to sleep right after his shift at Freddy's, but his body refused. He wasn't used to sleeping that early, so after hours of lying in bed with discomfort, he got up and walked into the living room. Corey was watching sports on the TV. Mike wanted to sit down and join him, but he looked out the window and saw the crisp and gorgeous blue sky. Bright clouds floated very slowly. There were almost no cars in sight. "I could change the channel," Corey said, knowing Mike wasn't interested in sports. "Nah," Mike replied. "I can't be watching TV on a day like this." Corey threw him a weird look. "What are you gonna do out there?" "I don't know. Take a walk, I guess. I mean, if it's that nice outside, I have to go out there." "Okay, hippie," Corey laughed. "Maybe you could stop by the library and pick up another job. A full-time one, without big-ass robots." "Yeah, I'll get around to it," Mike said. "I'll see you later." He sauntered out the door and down the stairs. Sure enough, upon stepping outside, the peace instantly overswept him. He started strolling down the sidewalk, passing by a neighborhood. There was almost no one in sight. The neighborhood was full of big green trees that provided adequate shade. The temperature was perfect. A very light breeze passed through the air. Birds and insects chirped. The sound of someone mowing their lawn in the distance didn't disrupt the peace. Mike hadn't taken a nice walk in so long. After the low November temperatures, this warm day felt refreshing. After he had passed several blocks, he saw the entrance to a somewhat woodsy area. There was a path leading into the nature-filled place. Mike walked on the wooden planks and came to a bridge just above a creek. He crossed it, taking a deep breath. The natural world was relaxing to be in. A parent and their child walked past him. He smiled at them as he made his way around. There were now bright green meadows just in front of the river. A walking trail along the middle of the fields wound around the whole park. Mike decided to keep going. The sound of a bell came from a few feet behind him. He instantly knew a cyclist was trying to pass, so he quickly moved to the side of the path. The cyclist proceeded. "Mike?" someone called. Mike looked around and saw a man walking toward him. The man's voice was somewhat high. He had a medium-length brown hair. He was tall and thin. He seemed to be in his mid-20s. He wore a jacket with a strange logo Mike didn't recognize, a green trophy surrounded by yellow spikes. Hey, Mike said lamely. "Do I know you?" "Well, you tell me," the man said. "I'm Mia's teacher. You're her father, right?" Mike looked at the man again, very vaguely recognized him. Oh, yeah, I remember you. You're Matt. No, Pat, right?" Close enough," he responded, now walking alongside Mike. "Your daughter's been talking about you a lot." Mike glanced up at him. "Really?" "Mm-hmm," the teacher nodded. "About your new job, how you work at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. I just hope you know what you're getting into." "What do you mean?" Mike asked. "I'm assuming you don't really know about the place's past and why it closed." Mike shook his head. I've heard some things. You see, this isn't its first rodeo. 10 years ago, the reason why it shut down was because some children went missing there." "Missing?" Mike asked with concern. He knew about Ryan and an animatronic biting someone, but missing children was completely new. "Yup, 5 kids. They say someone wore a mascot suit, lured them away, and they were never seen again. They also had tons of health code violations. One of them was blood oozing from the robots. Some people say the killer hid the children's bodies inside of the suits, and that's why there was blood." Whoa. "But hey, I mean, it's just a theory." Mike raised an eyebrow. What? "It's cool seeing you here, Mike," the man finished with a smile before jogging away, as if what he said was light. Mike stood in confusion and fear. Was this guy seriously not going to elaborate on anything? But more importantly, was what he said true? Mike finished a lap around the park before returning to the apartment building. He got in his car. His goal was to get his mind off of things since he was planning to never go back there. However, something about the place resonated with him, as if all of the dark history was almost interesting. He drove across town to the library. The drive was long, and nothing about Freddy's would leave his head. From the phone man's messages to the missing poster, bleached carpets, instant hiring, needing to have a child to enter, and these rumors he had just heard, it all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle. It was a puzzle Mike so desperately wanted nothing to do with, but found himself intrigued by. It was almost fascinating, unraveling the backstory of this place. He felt like he was now personally involved in something much bigger than a nighttime security gig. He parked at the library in his usual spot and walked in. "Michael," the librarian greeted. "How are you?" "Oh, hey," Mike laughed awkwardly. I'm fine. I was wondering if I could use the newspaper archive just to look for a new job." "A new job already?" she asked. "Yeah, I got the job at Freddy's and it's not working out." "Well, of course, you're welcome here any time." Mike nodded and went downstairs. He darted straight to the computer. A random teenager had finished using it and saw that Mike was waiting for it. The teen didn't log off before he left, making it easier for Mike. Mike smiled to subtly thank him and sat down in the computer chair. He went through the previous week's papers and printed out the section with hiring ads. One listing caught his eye: Hanford security guard. Everyone in the town knew the local nuclear site paid a fortune for even the smallest jobs. Mike decided he would shoot his shot and apply there, even if it was like putting a message in a bottle. Though it took a long time to print, and as he sat there, he let curiosity get the better of him. He moved the cursor up to the search bar and typed Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. He clicked the search button. Several old newspapers popped up. The first one was titled, "Kids Vanish at Local Pizzeria. Bodies Not Found." Mike scrolled down to read it. 2 local children were reportedly lured into a back room during the late hours of operation at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on the night of June 26th. While video surveillance identified the man responsible and led to his capture the following morning, the children themselves were never found and presumed dead. Police think that the suspect dressed as a company mascot to earn the children's trust. Mike's heart dropped. Mia's teacher was right. If there was any doubt about it before, that was now resolved. This was as real as ever. Mike checked the date and found that it was from 1983. He clicked onto the next paper, which was from the same week. 5 children now reported missing. Suspect charged. was the headline. Mike read the article. 5 children are now linked to the incident at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where a man dressed as a cartoon mascot lured them into a back room. While the suspect has been charged, the bodies themselves were never found. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has been fighting an uphill battle ever since to convince families to return to the pizzeria. It's a tragedy. A grainy black and white photo of the suspect was present in the corner of the page. He was oddly thin, his jawline was somewhat sharp, and his eyes were big and glassy. His hair was long. The next headline: Local pizzeria threatened with shutdown over sanitation. The article: Local pizzeria Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has been threatened again with shutdown by the health department over reports of foul odor coming from the much-loved animal mascots. Police were contacted when parents reportedly noticed what appeared to be blood and mucus around the eyes and mouth of the mascots. One parent likened them to reanimated carcasses. There was a picture of Freddy Fazbear standing in what looked like a doorway blocked by caution tape. Mike's stomach felt heavier with each article he read. He felt dirty and gross for having worked at this place. Against his gut feeling, he clicked on one more newspaper. Local pizzeria said to close by year's end. There was a picture of Freddy's from when they first opened. All of the mascots were standing tall and proud, balloons floated behind them, and a large grand opening banner hung from the ceiling. The walls in the background were clearly not as decayed. Mike continued to read the article. After a long struggle to stay in business after the tragedy that took place there, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has announced that it'll close by year's end. Despite a year-long search for a buyer, companies seem unwilling to be associated with the company. These characters will live on in the hearts of kids. These characters will live on. The CEO. This newspaper was from 1985. Mike minimized the newspaper archive tab and stared at the blue cloudy Windows 95 wallpaper. His heart felt frozen in his chest. He wanted to throw up from everything he had just read. How long has this gone on? Mike thought. Kids vanishing? Blood in the suits? It all explains so much. Mike already knew Freddy's existed long ago, but he had no idea why it actually shut down. This made so much sense. Children were lured away by a mascot, likely wearing one of the spring-lock suits May told them about. They were killed and stuffed into the empty costumes. Mia! Mike thought. He remembered taking his young daughter there and felt like dropping onto the ground. He kept his composure in front of the library guests around him, but his mind was filled with regret. He couldn't believe he had taken Mia to this place. He had put her life in danger. That's why the place is so dingy, and why the mascot suits are all stained and gross. That's why the walls are decaying and everything's run down. The building's been left to rot for who knows how long. His thoughts raced. When May was telling him he shouldn't be there and was urging him to be near Mia, it's because she knew. But why didn't she say anything? It explained everyone's weird behavior around the place. How many people had died in the past decade in relation to Freddy's? Mike looked at the newspaper tab again, with the picture of Freddy's. It was as if the cute brown bear was a symbol of death and horror. The seemingly innocent pizzeria and arcade was so full of darkness, like it was cursed somehow, and Mike had found himself here, in the middle of it all. There was only one thing left to do now. He had to prove everything. Robert sat up and glanced around. He instantly knew he was in the show stage room of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. He had been laying on one of the benches attached to the tables. He stood up and began walking around. The entire building was empty. "Peter?" he called out, not knowing why that was the first name to pop into his head. He ambled into the playroom, but the play structure and ball pit were not there. It was empty and the walls were all black instead of faded blue. Suddenly a faint noise broke the silence. A telephone ringing. There was a strange metallic sound coming from the dark corridor, as if something was crunched loudly, like a bear trap. Robert peered forward but couldn't see anything. When the phone rang again, the crunch sounded out a second time. Blood started running down the floor. Robert's heart started beating rapidly, knowing whose blood it was. The phone rang a third time, and more blood began pooling. The ground was now covered in a thick layer of it. The moist sounds of it running gave Robert an icy feeling. He shut his eyes and opened them to see the ceiling of his bedroom. "Well, you must have had one dream," his wife said playfully. Robert sat up and rubbed his head. He tried to remember the dream he just had, but it all only came back in bits and pieces. Though as soon as he remembered the phone ringing, everything hit him instantly. He felt like throwing up from the horror of it. The worst part was that It was real. The blood was on his hands, or rather, in his pizzeria, but he couldn't let his own family suffer for his own failures. "Yeah," he said, "I think I'm gonna go out there and have a drink." Robert walked through the hallway downstairs, through his living room into the kitchen. Both of his children were watching TV, their eyes glued to the vampire cartoon on the screen. Robert grabbed a bottle of Malibu and poured it into a standard coffee mug. He then put it back in the top cabinet and slowly strolled to the balcony. He opened the sliding glass door and slipped through quietly. The sky was dark, matching his mood. Several large pine trees filled his neighborhood. He stared at them, sipping the Malibu. He hoped the alcohol would take his mind off of the agonizing guilt he bore. Crickets chirped as the scene remained still. One dim orange streetlight illuminated the section of road in front of his house. The Malibu burned his throat but tasted decent compared to other alcoholic beverages he regularly drank. He picked up his cell phone and dialed Peter's number. He grazed his thumb over the call button but didn't press it. A few minutes later, his son walked out onto the balcony. Robert turned around out of surprise, caught off guard. "Oh, hey, Tim," he greeted. "Hey, Dad, what are you doing?" the boy asked. "I'm just out here," Robert answered awkwardly. "Chilling, you know?" "Okay, well, I'm headed off to bed. I just want to say goodnight." Before he could race off, Robert tapped on his shoulder. "Actually, I need to tell you something." As the alcohol partially took its course, Robert could feel the tension turn into slight dizziness. Tim turned around and Robert sat on a nearby chair to better face him at eye level. He didn't know how to start the lesson he sought to give. "You're a boy. A man. You're gonna be a man one day." "Yeah, being a man!" Tim yelled through clenched teeth, jokingly beating his chest. Robert would have otherwise found this funny. However, this moment was grim. "You've made mistakes before, right?" Tim nodded. "Yeah, we all do. We all mess up sometimes. It happens. It's always going to happen. But the true measure of a man is your reaction to your mistake." Robert could tell he had lost his son in this conversation and needed to use simpler terms. "It doesn't matter if you do something wrong or bad, especially on accident, but what does matter is admitting to that mistake. That's the manliest thing you can ever do." Robert knew his young son was taking this lesson for granted and hoped he would one day understand it before making mistakes as horrible as his own. "Why do you say that? Like, why right now?" Tim asked. "Did you make a mistake?" "Yeah, I did." Robert felt like crying. "There's someone on the team at Freddy's who just..." He didn't want to lie to his son, but he didn't know how to paraphrase or simplify what happened in a way where the secret wouldn't come out. He did a lot on the team. But we didn't treat him good, and now he's not there anymore. I just wish I had admitted it to him before it all got worse." Tim listened. "Anyway, you gotta get to bed. I love you, son." "I love you too," Tim replied. "Good night." He went through the open glass door and ran upstairs. Robert smiled until his young son was out of sight. He then turned around and frowned, wanting to jump off the top balcony. He wished he had taken his own advice and prayed his son would turn out more honest than him. That night guard also had a family, who would not only never see him again, but never know where he went. Robert continued to gaze into the night sky. Mike drove down the quiet, empty street, full of nervousness. If there was a time to turn back, it would be now. However, Mike wasn't planning on turning around. He picked up the hamburger he had just ordered and took a big bite out of it. He then put it back, ate a few French fries, and then took a sip of his soda. This was his way of preparing for the night ahead of him. He turned left next to his bank and passed a local bar. The Freddy Fazbear's Pizza LED sign instantly instilled more fear, but Mike wasn't going to give up now. He parked in the furthest corner from the building and stepped out of his car after finishing his meal. With more confidence than he knew he had, he marched up to the door. As usual, he put the key in the keyhole, twisted it, and pushed the door open. He pulled a small flashlight out of his pocket as he walked into the building quietly. He turned it on, instantly beaming it, lighting up the entire lobby. He quietly shut the entrance door behind him. He then went through the vestibule and into the diner, turning off the flashlight. He carefully tiptoed down the middle hall this time. He saw a clock in the hall. It was 2:03 a.m. Mike realized how loud his breathing was and made a conscious effort to breathe slowly and quietly. He quietly strolled to the left doorway and entered the show stage room. He scanned around, making sure none of the animatronics were there. The curtains were all closed, but as he analyzed the situation, Mike could hear humming. He instantly recognized the very low voice to be that of Foxy. Mike froze in his tracks just ahead of Pirate's Cove. He stared directly at the purple curtains in complete silence as the animatronic kept quietly singing. Mike stood with his feet shoulder-length apart, the flashlight in his hand. He thought about turning it on again, but didn't. Foxy stopped singing somewhat abruptly. Mike silently inhaled, holding his breath in. Suddenly, the purple curtains burst open and Foxy practically jumped out, sprinting at Mike. His mouth grew wider as he reached the end of the room. In just over a second, Mike quickly dove to the side as Foxy rushed past him. He got up and tried to walk over to the parts and service room, but Bonnie was standing in front of the door. Mike could feel his heart rate go crazy, as if he was about to explode. How had Bonnie moved so fast? Mike rushed to the end of the room and went down the hall to the office. He could hear Foxy following him, but was too scared to turn around. Foxy was just a few yards behind him. His eye patch was up and his mouth was wide. Mike rushed through the left doorway into the office and out the right. Foxy leaned sideways into it and let out a horrific scream from his speakers. Mike groaned in response, jumping through the right doorway from the office. Foxy seemed to freeze up after leaning into it. Mike ran down the hall and then back to the lobby. Chica stood in the middle just before the entrance. She held her plate with the bright pink animatronic cupcake. The cupcake's eyes became wider as Chica crept towards Mike. Mike turned around. Foxy was walking through his office. There was only one way out, through the middle hall again. He raced through it. Chica followed him but was too slow to catch up. He heard Freddy laughing and spotted him in the middle of the show stage room, so he darted to the arcade. Luckily, the arcade wasn't a common spot for the animatronics to go at night. Mike rarely ever saw them enter that area on the cameras. He tiptoed to it and hid between a claw machine and the wall. There was more space behind this claw machine than any of the other arcade games. He sat there, frozen in fear but also trapped. His heart was still racing from Foxy suddenly rushing at him. It was so random, and the animatronic was incredibly fast. Mike looked up every few minutes to see if any of them were drawing near. None of them did for a while. He sat still, catching his breath, thinking about ways to make it to the parts and service room. If he could just sneak around them and then stay hidden there, he could make it through the night. He knew the robots were incapable of opening doors. As he thought about what to do next, footsteps entered the cafe. Mike turned around and peeked through the glass of the claw machine. Chica was standing by the cased opening into the room. She scanned around, her pupils glowing white. Mike immediately ducked down and hoped Chica would just leave, but she didn't. She marched closer to the dining area, luckily not near the arcade. Mike waited patiently until the flashlight fell out of his pocket. It made a small thud as it hit the floor. His stomach dropped. He felt as good as dead. He picked up the flashlight and shuffled it back into his pocket. Sure enough, Chica was staring at him and now moving to him. "Shit, shit, shit," Mike chanted with each step, sprinting away from the arcade. He ran to the end of it and turned right. Luckily, no animatronic was in sight and his way back to the lobby. He tread quickly. Once he was there, he hid under a desk. He stared at the entrance and exit door, contemplating leaving. But he remembered the phone man's last message.
Maybe sometime you can check inside those suits in the back room.
If he could just make it to the parts and service room and have a quick look, he would be satisfied. He sat in silence. Mike eventually heard footsteps slowly getting closer and closer. He almost gasped when Bonnie's foot hit the floor next to the desk. Bonnie stopped and looked around. Mike's eyes widened. He was now cornered. If any animatronic knew he was there, this would be it. As Bonnie stormed away, Mike got an idea. In order to make it to the parts and service room, he needed the animatronics to all be in one place. He looked down all three hallways. None of the robots were in sight. He suddenly tossed his flashlight into the arcade. It struck the glass screen of one of the arcade games and made a loud clank. He hoped they all heard that and were drawn to it. Sure enough, he could hear several animatronics marching into the arcade. He couldn't tell which ones, though. He turned around and rushed down the hall to his office. He instantly closed both doors and looked at the cameras. Bonnie and Chica were wandering around the arcade. Foxy was lingering in the show stage room. Freddy stood still in the playroom. All of the animatronics were in different parts of the building, but now Mike could see them clearly. Suddenly, he heard a knock at one of the doors. He gasped and peered through the left side window where he heard it. He instantly went back to the cameras and checked the ones pointed near the doors just outside his office. Nothing. He looked all around the building and found Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy in the same places. So who could have been at the door? Mike now didn't feel comfortable going anywhere. He stayed behind in the office, looking at the cameras frantically with the doors still shut. Suddenly, he heard the loud knocking again. "Fuck!" he gasped, jumping back in fear. He glanced at the cameras once more to confirm yet again that the animatronics were not around. The Celebrate poster in the hall with Freddy now showed something different. It was the top half of Freddy's head, but rather than Freddy Fazbear, it was the yellow, eyeless one he had seen in the parts and service room with May. His heart sank. A light in the hallway flickered for a moment, pictures changing, lights flickering. Mike became tense imagining the real horror he was up against. What if it was much more than just child murders? He always had a deep feeling in the back of his mind about it, and now his suspicions were beginning to take fruition. He sat and left the monitor off, wanting to conserve as much power as possible. He waited for about another hour before checking the cameras again. Mike glanced at the time. It was already almost 5:30. Without any conception of time for most of the night, he had no idea how long he was running around hiding for. But he only had 30 minutes to make it to the parts and service room. Upon looking through the cameras, he saw Chica was in the playroom, Bonnie was in the arcade, and no one seemed to be in the show stage room. Mike pressed the left door button. The mechanical door slid upward very slowly. It finally receded into the ceiling and Mike stared into the abyss. Nothing. He carefully ran out of the hall and tried to pass by the party tables, but Foxy raced at him. This time, Mike didn't feel like running away. He felt like fighting back to see what would happen, taking a risk. He moved to the side before kicking his leg out to trip Foxy. Foxy's metal leg hooked around Mike's foot and he fell to the ground. Before Mike could walk away, he heard the sound of a child giggling. He turned around and looked in the corner of the room where the golden Freddy was sitting. Its head was tilted all the way to the side, knees tucked into its stomach, the way Mike saw it in the room earlier. This time, it fully stood up on its own and ran at him. It made a low roaring sound as it moved. Mike quickly descended into the parts and service room, slamming the door behind him. He had no idea how this animatronic activated so suddenly. It scared him nearly to death. He had never seen the golden Freddy suit move like this on its own in any of the nights. But now, none of that mattered, because he was finally in the room he wanted to be in. He turned on the light. The walls were all covered in shelves full of animatronic parts. Mike looked around the room, trying to calm down by taking measured breaths. There were several mascot heads, as well as costume bodies and electronic parts all over. They were scattered in unorganized piles. He glanced at the lifeless mascot faces. Some of the robotic parts had fallen onto the floor. They were all extremely dusty with cobwebs all over them. There was a large table in the middle of the room that took up most of the space. Mike had to walk around it the whole time. Once the fear died down, he started to remember what he was doing here. He was trying to look inside the suits for anything he could find. However, the thought of that golden Freddy still haunted his mind. Its eyes were filled with darkness. It had emerged from seemingly out of nowhere. The child's laugh was extremely disturbing. Mike looked around, wondering if the golden Freddy was in animatronic mode rather than suit mode. Though who could have activated it? And why? This was the only logical solution he could imagine, so he tried to focus on that. He paced around the table. He grabbed a Bonnie head sitting on the top shelf and looked inside it. The inside of the mascot head smelled foul, but he couldn't find any discernible evidence of anything wrong. He threw it onto the table. He then grabbed a Freddy Fazbear head. If any blood was there, it would be too dark to see. He put the mascot head on for a second. This one was especially putrid. Whereas the felt on the Bonnie head smelled like old food and grease, Freddy's head smelled worse. It reeked of death. Mike immediately took it off and tossed it onto the table, coughing from the stench. He walked over to the corner of the room and noticed that it actually continued into a very short hall. There was a pile of animatronic bodies and parts filling it up. He dragged out a huge Chica suit and noticed that it looked very different from the normal Chica animatronic. Its beak was much bigger, wider, and more pointy. It had no eyebrows. Mike wondered if it was a springlock suit. Its hands were torn off and messes of wires poured out. He looked through it, opening the compartments and looking inside its huge open beak. Nothing. He tossed it aside. He then grabbed a huge Freddy suit. It also looked different. Its head shape was thinner. The fabric was brighter but torn in several places. It had a much bigger jaw with teeth on the top row of its mouth. Under its black bow tie were buttons. Mike wondered why these spare mascot suits looked nothing like the normal animatronics. He figured they were old spares. The inside of the mascot suit smelled awful, but there was nothing else inside. Mike maneuvered back in and dug out a Bonnie costume, which didn't even have a head. It was more blue than purple, and it also had black buttons under its red bow tie like the Freddy one. This one was heavier than the rest. Underneath was a Foxy suit that had a triangular jaw and tattered fabric on one of its ears. Upon dragging out the alternate Bonnie costume, flies and other insects began buzzing upward. Mike's face contorted in disgust. He was looking for this, and halfway expected it, but it still scared him. As he placed the suit on the ground, his fingers were shaking, his heart was racing, and his stomach was dropping ever so slowly. It was all too real now. He undid the small latch underneath its belly and opened it up. Blood instantly dripped out, and Mike stared at the corpse inside. It was curled up. Mike recognized the face to be that of Ryan, the guy from the missing poster at the nearby gas station. Mike came in looking for evidence, but now that he found some, he regretted it. It was the closure he wanted so badly, until he didn't. The man's body was mutilated by all the robotic parts piercing his skin constantly. Mike leaned down and threw up the burger and fries he consumed on the way there. He stood up straight and stumbled backward until he reached the wall. He knew he couldn't leave the room until 6 a.m. Seeing the actual bloody carcass before him made him extra cautious and extra afraid of the animatronics. Mike finally reached his limit. All suspicions were confirmed. Every minute spent in the room with the dead body felt like an hour. Mike tried to cover his face, especially his nose, as he sat in horror. From the week of flipping his sleep schedule and constantly staring at the bright monitors, his eyes burned whenever he shut them. He felt exhausted yet paranoid at the same time. He could hear whimpers in his head. He thought it was himself whimpering uncontrollably, but when he took a deep breath, he realized that they came from somewhere else. He put his ear up to the door and listened. He could hear the sound of a child crying. "Hello?" he called out nervously. The crying stopped. Mike's heart was racing faster than ever now. His hands were twitching aggressively and he couldn't contain himself. He stared at the door with wide eyes. "Please, help me," the childish voice cried. Mike stood up and found himself pacing the half of the room without Ryan's body. Every movement felt weak as his nerves drowned in fear and adrenaline. He figured nothing good could come from opening that door. The charming sound of a grandfather clock rang out through the building when Mike least expected it. He could see the lights turn on through the crack in the door. Knowing the robots couldn't hurt him now, he reached for the doorknob. He didn't want to open the door just yet, especially after hearing the abnormal sounds of a child, but he had enough of being stuck in the room. He slowly stepped toward the door and put his hand on the cold metal knob. He twisted it and cracked it open. He peered through the crack in the door as he pulled it very slowly. His heavy breathing filled the room, and no other noise could be heard. Bonnie was standing just outside. Bonnie walked into the door as if it wasn't there, its body pushing it open. Mike screamed and stumbled backwards onto the ground, watching his life flash before him. He kicked up at the animatronic's legs, but it did nothing to stop him from walking forward. He stood tall above Mike. Mike stared into Bonnie's dark eyes. Bonnie bent down, but to Mike's shock, didn't attack him. The robot became eye level with him. Bonnie slowly moved his arm out and toward the back of his neck. He clicked something and gripped his own head. He started pulling his arm forward aggressively. Mike watched carefully. The arm pulled hard enough to rip the mascot head off. The metal clanking of the head disconnecting echoed throughout the room as it fell onto the floor. Underneath the mask was the head of a little boy. But his head was transparent and pale, colorless. His eyes were completely black. There were several scars in his skin. His pupils were two small lights inside of his pitch black eyes. "Help me," he pleaded, his voice echoey. He shut his eyes and began crying softly. His dark tears dripped onto the floor. Mike screamed and ran past the animatronic. He rushed to the playroom and took a sharp right turn into the lobby hall. A mother was walking with her child, but Mike didn't care. He bumped into her as he ran for his life, continuing to yell. He weaved around the incoming guests and into the parking lot. He felt like vomiting again, but didn't. He looked back at the restaurant only once more. May stood in the vestibule, watching him leave through the glass door with a neutral expression. Mike raced to his car and quickly hopped into it. He sped off, leaving Freddy Fazbear's Pizza for good. A special report graphic flashed across the screen in a big white font surrounded by red. Good evening, my name is Jessica Jasmine. We start with a special report. Just last month, family restaurant Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was investigated after a gruesome discovery was made by an employee. In the maintenance room, Ryan Ramey, a 49-year-old man, was found dead inside of one of the restaurant's mascot suits. Zach Francis and Colin Ram, two 25-year-old men who attempted to steal from the place, were also found dead in the premises. It was revealed that the mascots were extremely dangerous and violent to employees. B-roll of cop cars outside of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza played on screen to everything the news anchor was saying, along with brief flashes of photos of Colin, Zach, and Ryan. The next video that played was of Robert being interviewed in a courtroom. "I'd just like to say, to my family, I'm sorry," he announced. The sadness was present in his face. More stock video of Robert in court hearings played as the anchor continued. The owner, Robert Schultz, confessed numerous felonies to law enforcement that have been formally investigated. The chain, since its reopening last year, has been responsible for 4 deaths. However, investigators say this isn't the first time Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has been home to tragedy. We bring you to Tom Jensen, who has more on the story. A transition graphic displayed, and then showed a young man in the studio standing in front of a TV screen. Hi Jessica, the local loved family restaurant Freddy Fazbear's Pizza first closed its doors in 1985, 2 years after 5 children went missing. Old reports in newspapers say night guard Dave Miller lured them away using a mascot suit, only for them to never be seen again. He wasn't charged until strong evidence was found in 1987 linking him to the disappearances. However, he evaded authorities. Last month it was discovered that he was hiding with a new identity as Peter Simmons and continued to work at the pizzeria. A picture of Dave was on screen next to a picture of quote-unquote Peter. The similarities were obvious now. He is now continuing to evade authorities, so if you see him, call 911 immediately. The camera switched back to show the main anchor again. Thank you, Tom. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has since been abandoned, and officials say it may be closing for good. With his false identity as Peter Simmons exposed to the public, Dave Miller had been in hiding for over a month. He had no friends or relatives left in the area, and with the police seizing his car, he had nowhere to go. He wandered the streets aimlessly, wearing a large black trench coat. As winter came, it only became cooler and darker outside. One night, the freezing rain was so bad that Dave's fingers were going numb. His movements became slow. He knew he had to find shelter, or else he'd be as good as dead. He hated constantly lurking in alleyways, always looking over his shoulder, so he turned to the one place he knew well, the place he always ended up coming back to. He gazed at the abandoned building that used to be Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The parking lot was empty and the big LED sign was gone. Its shape was faded onto the building. The windows were all boarded up and it was clearly in poor condition. Dave scanned around. It was almost 2 a.m. and no one was nearby. He crept up to the building and began kicking at one of the boards repeatedly with his heavy boots until it snapped open, just enough for him to crawl through. He climbed inside. It was only slightly warmer than the outside. The tables and carpet were still there, though the arcade games had all been removed. There were more cobwebs and water seeping in through several places. Dave couldn't believe the building decayed this much in only a month without maintenance. He strolled down the hall to the lobby, and then all the way to the office. It was dark and difficult to see, but he knew the place like the back of his own hand. When he got there, he started feeling the lockers on the wall. He opened his locker and fished around for a small key in the back. Once he found it, he walked down the left hallway and into the show stage room. The red curtains were open and the animatronics were all on stage. They looked lifeless, their eyes fixed on the tables once swarmed by children that were now swarmed with insects. Dave went through the playroom. The metal bars holding up the slides and tunnels were even rustier than before. He stopped at the cafe and found the 2 large red doors. His slow, frozen fingers had trouble shifting the key into the keyhole and turning it all the way. The doors hadn't been opened in over a decade, and he had to budge to get the key to move. Once he finally got the door unlocked, he pulled it open. The other red door automatically opened with it. Behind the doors was simply a wall. Dave remembered how the company sealed off what was once called the safe room so long ago after he had murdered in it. He chuckled to himself, proud of his work. He knocked on the wall and could instantly tell it was flimsy and weak drywall with no frame or insulation. He kicked at it only once and his foot instantly went through. It didn't take long for him to keep kicking and pushing for all of it to break open. He swept all of the broken pieces of drywall into the room. He figured if anyone came to look for him, they'd think the doors were just for display. He could lock them from the inside and nobody would know. They would still think the room was sealed. He stepped inside. It had been untouched for longer than the rest of the building. Water leaked in through the cracks in the floorboard and pipes. There was mold growing on the walls. Dust covered every inch of it. The 3 arcade machines in there for maintenance were still standing. The lockers in the back were all rusty. And in the corner of the room, he found what he was looking for. He walked over to the large Spring Bonnie mascot suit. Mold and age had turned the once bright yellow color into an ugly shade of green. Suddenly, footsteps became audible as someone drew near. Dave turned around and grabbed a fire axe from the other corner and carefully looked out the open doors. Bonnie opened his eyes and mouth wide, about to attack Dave, but suddenly froze as he reached the doorway to the room. Dave laughed, knowing the programming in Bonnie's system didn't recognize it. However, he found it odd that the robot could still see and recognize him in a room it wasn't supposed to know existed. He chalked it up to the scanners in its eyes. He walked up to Bonnie. He tossed his trench coat onto the ground and revealed his fitted purple dress shirt. He swung the fire axe at Bonnie's neck area twice. The second time it struck, the endoskeleton's head fell off. Dave knew the neck area was more thin and frail than the rest of it, and when Bonnie's head fell off, the rest of the animatronic powered off. Its body fell to the floor lifelessly. Dave stepped out of the room and picked up Bonnie's head. He took the mascot head off and stared at the endoskeleton face. There were 2 black bulbs behind the animatronic's eyes, with tiny light-up scanners. There was a small metallic jaw that was shaped like a human jaw. A groaning sound coming from Bonnie's inner speakers startled Dave. He tossed both the mascot head and the endoskeleton head on the floor. He was surprised that it was still functioning, so he opened Bonnie's chest and began crushing the endoskeleton with his fire axe. The metal devices all broke apart, and the wires inside were cut. When Dave was finally done, he left Bonnie's destroyed parts just outside the room. And just before stepping back behind the red doors, the lights of the building flickered. Dave looked up, confused. He always thought Freddy's had bad wiring, but the power should have been completely shut off. "Where are we going?" Mia asked. "You'll see," Mike smiled. He grabbed his sunglasses from the dashboard and put them on, accidentally knocking his Hanford security badge onto the car's floor. Mia picked it up for him and put it back where it was. The sky was a bright shade of blue. Mike enjoyed the vibrance of the day. "Is everything that happened to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza true?" "What do you know about that?" "Kids at school say there was someone who killed people there." Mike felt his heart sink a little bit. He didn't want to let his young, innocent daughter in on the horrors of Freddy's that he himself was still trying to forget. He also didn't want to be reminded of the time his daughter was only a few feet away from Dave and the robots. He regretted the fact that he went to the storage room and ordered pizza without keeping a close eye on her that one day. But he took a deep breath and tried to focus on what was happening in the moment. "Oh, yeah, that happened a long time ago," Mike said, as though everything was still behind him. "Yup, that was in 83. As they drove down several highways, a familiar song came on. He heard the tune of Everyday Struggle by Notorious B.I.G. It was a popular song and played often. As soon as the lyrics started, Mike found himself frowning and uncomfortable. He switched to another station. Not only did he not want Mia to hear the depressing lyrics, but he himself didn't feel that way anymore. And he knew filling his mind with that sort of music could bring him back to the depressing path he had just escaped. The next station was playing Basket Case by Green Day, a song both Mike and Mia liked. They sang it together as the air breezed through the open windows of the car. Mike eventually took a turn onto a diagonal road. "What do you think happened to the killer?" Mia asked. "He's probably getting what he deserves," Mike answered. He slowed the car down as they pulled up to a rural house just off the diagonal highway. Off of the diagonal highway. There was a big yard full of long, bright green grass. A few huge trees provided shade all over the yard. There was a pathway leading up to the white home. Mia gasped when she spotted a trampoline in the yard. "Is this your new house?" Mia asked excitedly. "Yup." "I love it!" she screamed. She opened the car door, excited to jump on the trampoline, but Mike stopped her. "Wait," he commanded. She was already halfway out the car. She turned around. "Can you reach into the glove box? I think I forgot something in there." Mia opened it, not expecting a brand new Game Boy to fall out. Its plastic casing was see-through. All the internal workings of the device were visible. She let out a scream of joy and instantly rushed to hug her father. Mike laughed. "It's a late Christmas gift. Now, when Corey gets here, help me unpack." Corey was driving the U-Haul and was minutes behind Mike. Mike decided to walk over to the house, though there was a small pink piece of paper taped to the door. The top of it had notice of termination printed on it, with "You're fired" in parentheses. The reasons that were written were general unprofessionalism, tampering with the animatronics, odor. Mike felt odd about the fact that they had mailed this to his new house. It had taken so long to get through the mail and all the commotion and chaos about Freddy's that it ended up here. Mike took the piece of paper off the door. He found it funny that he was apparently fired for discovering someone's death. But it all meant nothing to him anymore. So he ripped it in half. He then put the two halves together and ripped them into fourths, and so on, until the piece of paper was nothing but confetti to decorate his new porch. Foxy sat idly behind the thick purple fabric. There was only a small crack of light in Pirate's Cove. Behind Foxy's eyes, Terence watched the walls. He had no reason to move or speak at all. Living inside of the animatronic was agonizing. He only had small glimpses of his old life. He thought about his parents and siblings often. He also held burning anger, hatred, and rage against the employee who took his life so long ago. Terence could still feel his presence somehow. As he remained alone with his thoughts, he heard hushed murmurs. He moved toward the curtains and used his pirate hook to open them. Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica were not at the stage. Terence noticed something moving on the wall, a shadow. The shadow was in the shape of Freddy. It was clearly waving him over to the playroom. Terence remembered the last time someone waved him over into a room, and that was how his soul ended up tied to Foxy the pirate. But this time it felt different. Terence lived a miserable existence and figured nothing could be worse than his current state, so he followed the shadow, stepping out of Pirate's Cove and into the playroom. The scanners in the animatronic's eyes activated so that Terence could see in the dark. He crept forward. The shadow was now at the other end of the room, waving him over to the cafeteria. Terence remembered the place he was moving toward and didn't want to go any further. However, he knew being murdered again would somehow be the best thing for him. He thought he might finally pass on, so he continued into the cafe, twitching slightly in shock. His footsteps against the ground were loud. He looked down at the floor and saw a mess of metallic parts and mascot costumes. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and the Golden Freddy were all torn apart. The mascot suits were carelessly thrown onto the ground. The pieces of broken endoskeletons were scattered. Foxy stumbled backward. Before he could even blink, the familiar man in the purple shirt appeared before him. Dave flipped a small lever in the back of his neck and removed the mascot head. Terence's vision was suddenly less obstructed without it. He could now see everything all at once without Foxy's snout in the way. He was never sure if he was the whole robot or just its middle endoskeleton. He was shocked to find out the latter was true. Dave grabbed his fire axe and hacked at the neck of the robot a few times. Terence felt the jabs of the axe's blade. It had been so long since he felt anything at all, but he remembered this feeling very well. Pain. The third strike with Dave's axe pushed him to the ground. He hit the endoskeleton neck of Foxy over and over until the head broke off. He tore off the mascot suit, which was difficult. He stomped on Foxy's leg and then proceeded to hack it with the axe until it came off. He looked around at the mess of parts all over the floor. He thought about sweeping it later, but as he started walking back into the red doors, he heard a whimper. Dave spun around, taking a flashlight out. He shined it around. No one else was in the building, yet he could feel the presence of someone or something nearby. He heard. He instantly jerked the flashlight to where Chica's remains sat in disarray. There, in the thick ray of light, he saw a child standing. Their skin was white and somewhat transparent. The light seemed to shine through them. As soon as the beam landed on the child, they uncovered their eyes. Dave recognized the little girl by her once blonde, curly hair. Dark tears were falling from the two dark spots where Susie's eyes used to be.
It's me,
she sobbed. No! Dave said. He wondered if this was a hallucination based on his own guilt, but he never bore guilt. And why would he only have these hallucinations now unless they were real? He heard an electronic gurgling come from right beside him and aimed the flashlight at it. Another child was running at him. The kid's eyebrows were narrowed into an angry expression and his mouth was open wider than any human. His eyes were pitch black. Dark tears ran down his face as he began screaming while lunging toward Dave. Dave jumped back in fear, gasping loudly. "Get away from me!" he screamed. He recognized the tall, skinny child by the part in the middle of his long, dark hair. "You!" Terence whispered angrily. Dave could see another boy standing up from the pile of broken animatronic parts. He was of African-American descent and wore a once red sweater. "You did this!" Dominique groaned. Dave whipped the flashlight all around the room. In the corner, a long-haired boy with overalls was giggling while tilting his head. Matthew. Dave remembered them all instantly. All of their stab wounds were still on their bodies, all bleeding profusely as if they were new and fresh. However, their blood was as dark as the night sky. Before Dave could even process what was going on, he felt someone tugging on his shirt. He looked down immediately. "Hello?" the boy said. Dave jumped back into the room behind him. He barely recognized Aaron. He remembered the boy's golden, combed-over, medium-length hair that was now in a mess.
"I recognize you, but I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore," Aaron said.
Dave realized they were all speaking through electronic devices around the building, like speakers and auditory devices that should have been powered off. Dave screamed and stumbled backwards in complete fear. After all of the death he had seen and caused over the years, the thing that scared him most were his past actions coming to haunt him. The fear he put in the eyes of these innocent children was now tenfold in his own. He was completely oblivious to the paranormal. He never believed in it, so seeing the literal ghost of his past coming back frightened him more than anything. The children continued marching toward him, chattering in hushed whispers. Dave tripped over a broken animatronic part, falling onto the floor. 4 children stood by the 2 open red doors, blocking Dave in. He then turned and looked for Aaron, only to see that the boy was standing right above him. Get the fuck away from me!" Dave yelled. He hopped onto his feet and raced to the other side of the room near the 3 deactivated arcade games, but Aaron followed him. The cold realization that this was not just in his head hit him like a brick. He knew the hallucination would be over by now, but this wasn't just some nightmare. He leaned down to the side, feeling the urge to puke, but nothing came out. He hadn't eaten in days. He was thin and malnourished. "Fucking hell no! This isn't real!" he cried. The children all laughed. Their laughter echoed through Dave's ears as it came through the speakers. He rushed around Aaron, going back to the other side. He accidentally bumped his foot into the spring Bonnie suit. He peered down at it, remembering how powerful and fearless he felt inside of it. In the heat of the moment, he figured the ghosts would fear the costume that led to their death. He started putting it on as quickly as he could, piece by piece. He fit his body into the chest and legs before attaching the head. Each piece clicked onto metal latches. He still knew exactly how to put it on. The children all went silent as they saw the face that lured them away so long ago. The golden rabbit. Aaron stood in place, still unafraid. Dave started maniacally laughing, feeling the rush of power as he looked at the children through the spring Bonnie mask. However, Aaron could sense nervousness in his cackle. He walked toward them, stepping in a puddle of water that had seeped into the room. His eyes were locked onto the glowing orbs of light inside of Aaron's. The rest of the children, still together by the door to the safe room, stood by. The room was mostly silent now, aside from the raindrops tapping against not only the ground, but the roof of the building. Though suddenly, the water started to seep into the now decayed springlock suit. The fabric absorbed some of it, but it began sinking into the inner mechanisms. Just then, David remembered that water moistens the spring locks and can activate them. Though a split second later, this bit of knowledge couldn't save him. The springlock suit went into animatronic mode. Gears, wires, and metal beams held against the side of the costume began to connect despite Dave's body being in the way. Dave screamed. The robotic parts didn't stop pressing through him. Metallic pieces of the inner mechanisms pierced his flesh. The suit's decaying speakers played the Toreador March song, the song that usually accompanied Spring Bonnie's activation on stage at the beginning of shows. And for the ghosts of his young victims watching, the show was just beginning. Not a single metal part held back from trying to connect to form the inner animatronic. Dave felt the pain of 1,000 knives stabbing him at once. Warm blood oozed out of every orifice of the costume. The sharp endoskeleton clicking together was the worst part. Large bars of metal forced their way into his body. Dave fell onto the ground. He looked up at the kids. Their smiles were horrifying and unnaturally wide. Dave screeched so loud that several capillaries in his face began to burst. His shrieking could be heard from outside the decaying restaurant if anyone was near it, but there was no one to help him or save him now. His fingers started to lose feeling as metal parts clicked together through his entire hands. Bones in his hands snapped. Sharp pieces stabbed through his chest and only slowed down when they reached his skeleton. He could feel his forehead and cheeks get gored continuously. Blood quickly rushed into his head. His face being stabbed was incredibly painful. The grotesque sounds of his piercing flesh, along with some of his bones crunching and snapping in the suit, were music to the children's ears. The crimson blood began creating a giant puddle around him. Because his body was in the way of certain parts of the suit, pieces of it started to break open. The Spring Bonnie costume began to crack, and wires and parts slipped out. The children laughed as they watched him. It was now he who was being stabbed to death. It was now he who was being forced into a suit. It was now he who was helpless. It's as though every wound he inflicted on them so long ago all came back to him at once in this one moment. Aaron remembered dying the exact same way, though he was fortunate enough to die only mere seconds after Dave snapped him in the Golden Freddy Springlock suit. Dave would have to suffer 1,000 times the pain Aaron ever did. Dominique, Matthew, Terence, and Susie all giggled louder than ever now, all at once. Aaron watched with a smile. Dave tried to cry out for help, apologizing only to stop the pain, hoping the mercy of God would save him. But God would spare the wicked man no mercy. He reached up his arms to try and take off the Spring Bonnie head. Every movement hurt. His face was finally free from the suit for just a moment as he pulled the mask off. He spat out the blood he was gargling. 2 small metal bars from within the top of the Spring Bonnie head pressed down and buried themselves in the corners of his mouth, piercing into his jaw. They forced his mouth open. He couldn't physically close it. The rest of the head crunched back down and Spring Bonnie's mouth moved robotically. He twitched in reaction to the constant pain. The moment when the locks were all done clicking was the worst part. The music stopped. He was left with only the pain, all at once. He could not only see the blood all around him, but red, shiny, organic bits of flesh escaping the holes the suit had punctured on its own. Dave wished the pain would kill him instantly, but it wasn't going to be this easy to escape. One last time, he turned his head up to see the pale kids. They started vanishing, their bodies slowly disappearing into the air. Dave had fallen onto his side, too weak to move. He gazed at the wall. The last thing Dave saw was the shadow silhouette of Freddy, standing at the other end of the room. The pain made it difficult to process anything. "Please," he pleaded. But the blood in his mouth, along with the metallic parts prying his jaw open, made it impossible to talk. The shadow on the wall was the last thing he saw before he eventually blacked out entirely. David Miller was dead. His corpse sat inside the rotting Spring Bonnie suit, which continued to spill out blood for a while. The shadow watched with pity. It disappeared through the entrance to the room, its movement causing a wind that slammed the 2 big red doors shut. That was the last sound before the building fell silent. Thank you guys so much for listening through. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. Huge thanks to the names on your screen for voicing the animatronics. Their links are in the description. I actually wrote the story in like 2015 or 2016, and I'm so happy to finally get it out there in the 10th year that Five Nights at Freddy's has been around. I'd quickly like to point out that my story doesn't fully depict the canon, like the killer really is Dave Miller, which I've always liked more than William Afton, and he's not part of Mike's family at all. Only the first 4 games are canon in this universe, just pointing that out in case any fans think, hey, this isn't accurate to the games. It's just my own version, like how there's Rob Zombie's Halloween. That's why I named this Tom's Five Nights at Freddy's. So yeah, be sure to like and subscribe if you like this. Go star the written version on Wattpad below, and I will see you guys later. Cold laughter filled the room. Aaron didn't realize he was dreaming. He had lived inside of the Golden Freddy for so long that he still saw through the eyes of the mascot head in his dreams. He was used to seeing the bare snout in front of his face constantly, as if it was his nose. He turned his head to the right. It took a long time before it finally rotated around. Bonnie stood beside him on the stage. He then turned all the way to the left. Chica was on his other side. As he looked back to Bonnie, the laughter grew and turned into a mix of high-pitched noises Aaron couldn't discern. Bonnie was now staring at him. He looked back at Chica, scanning the rows of empty tables before the stage. Chica was also staring. There was a quiet melody faintly playing. When Aaron turned to look at Bonnie again, he saw Freddy in front of him as well. Bonnie's eyes were extremely dark and he looked creepy. Aaron was unnerved. As he turned back to the middle, the music from earlier became louder. It was a music box melody of my grandfather's clock. And suddenly, as the tune ended, a white mask jumped into his vision. He could only see the top half of it. Lights behind the mask's eyes looked into his soul. When he woke up, he suddenly remembered her. The puppet. Though his memories were scattered and distorted, Aaron couldn't believe he had forgotten her. "Where are you?"